Hello, everyone, and today I'm going to rank the players that were in the modern era, which is from Big Brother 16 to Big Brother 22. And I'm going to rank them based on the 7 tiers that I've used in all of my videos. So, Abysmal, Bad, Potential, Mediocre, Solid, Good, and Great. And because there's returnees in this era and some who are on other eras, I'm going to include for that one person their entire Big Brother journey up to this point. So, for an example, Janelle, I'm going to include her BB6, BB7, BB14, and BB22 experience here. So, you'll have the entire picture. So, pertaining to this era, it actually kind of held up better than I thought it was, since I like half of these seasons and I don't really like the other half. While with the post classic era, there are definitely a lot more seasons I didn't really care for in general. But, anyways, we're just going to get right to the list and not waste much time. So, the first person in discussion at dead last, which is 102nd, is Megan from Big Brother 19. So she was on the outs immediately based on her poor social game, was targeting people who were in power, and she ended up quitting early because she couldn't handle the game and got involved in a lot of drama. Megan would have been the first boot had she not quit and not won the veto anyways, and I don't see her doing well in any season. Not only just because she quit early on, but because she doesn't really have much of the skills to really do well in Big Brother. At 101st is Joey from Big Brother 16. So she had absolutely no clue about the game, but she was safe for a lot of the week, so she could have been in a decent enough position had she just relaxed. She talked to the woman about making a girls' alliance, despite not having a relationship with most of these women, and admitted it to the guys, while also having a cringe campaign. It seemed like she admitted it to the guys because she thought honesty would cause them to endear her or cause her to be endeared to them, but it just made them target her even more. And obviously, she didn't really know how to communicate well enough to cause people to want to keep her. I don't see her doing well on any season, really. At 100th is Paola from Big Brother 16. She was on the block the entire time she was in the house, which was 2 weeks. She had very little relationships with people on a personal or strategic level outside of outsiders like Donnie and Jocasta, who were doing poorly their damn selves. She was horrendous in competitions, which was only exemplified, causing her to be nominated a lot due to Battle of the Block. She came off as shady to agreeing to throw the Battle of the Block, especially for a hated HOH, and ended up going home when she was the pawn. Paula had no idea about anything that was going on and thus poor on most seasons since she wasn't really liked either. At 99th is Caitlyn from Big Brother 20. Unlike the others, Caitlyn was in the majority alliance, which is why she's higher than the others, so she does have that ability to get in a solid alliance. Despite that, she sketched out her allies in her erratic behavior, like flipping her vote to boot an ally last minute, getting jealous due to two of her allies getting into a showmance, winning HOH when she was in the middle of the house due to her flipping her vote, and then being conned into targeting her ally while expecting her other allies to want to continue working with her. Even the other side got tired of her to the point where she was the first unanimous vote of the season. I don't see Caitlyn making it to jury on any season. At 98 is Cody from Big Brother 19. A part of me really wanted to put him at dead last, but he is still very close. Cody won the very first HOH and actively decided to create a hostile, divisive environment, but he was in the majority at that point. But his aloofness and targeting two people in their alliance ruined his game. He then started acting like him having to nominate a third of the house was why he was in this position, but he was bragging about that fact when he was still in power and still had his alliance. So he was only using that as a complaining point once he couldn't send home Paul. Cody was booted the very next week and then came back into the game where he encouraged Jessica to make the horrendous move of not vetoing Ramses off the block. There are so many twists needed to get him to the jury, which tanked him even more on this list, and he only has competitions on his side. Cody is horrendous socially, isn't good strategically, doesn't have the ability to take accountability, and it means that he doesn't have the basic skills to improve on his faults. At 97th is Devin from Big Brother 16. Like Cody, he is also someone who had power for a short period of time in the house and was in a powerful alliance for a bit, so that is why he is higher than the others in this tier. He isn't as low because he didn't need a buyback, but Devin is still an awful player. He invited two people into his alliance without telling anyone about it, came off as intimidating to people, and didn't have very good social skills with people in and out of his alliance, as he continuously talked at people. He continuously changed plans while he was HOH, and then targeted an ally that people didn't want gone. And then he did absolutely nothing when he had no power, so he doesn't have the capability to fight or campaign for himself. He seemed more self aware of his faults compared to a Cody, so that is another reason why he is higher. At 96 is Audrey from Big Brother 17. She fits the pattern of the people around her on this list. People who were able to get into a majority alliance, but it is extremely short lived, mainly of their own doing. She was active in the game, which was good, and was able to bring people in, but she planted way too many unnecessary seeds and caused too much dissension, where her game was blown up at the end of the first week. Luckily for her, the other side wanted to use her for a shield, but she did the same thing to them, and they had enough, so they booted her for being a liability. I also don't think Audrey can handle the game for a long time regarding her mental health. She wasn't good at competitions and didn't know how to pace herself, so I can't see her doing any better. And she didn't even campaign to save herself when she was on the block. At 95th is Isabella from Big Brother 21. She continues the trend of people who are in majority alliances, but not only blows up the alliance, but goes home in a few weeks. Isabella was in the prime position as she had good relationships with people on both sides of the house, but she kept on repeating everything she knew to each side of the house, and they both got sick of her really quickly. In addition to that, she really had some horrible reads, and people really grew to dislike her personality. So she was an easy person to boot, even compared to a Sam or a Nick. Since she was also poor in competitions, though it says a lot that the person she tried to save ended up booting her the very next week. She seems more stable than the others around her on this list, but are below her, and she did acknowledge her flaws, so here she is, a bit higher than some of the others. At 94th is Josiah from Big Brother 18. I'm shocked he's on the higher end of this tier, but I guess it says more about the people below him. Josiah immediately started talking about targeting the veterans and continued doing so when one of them was in power, and also telling this to the other veteran, and Devon. Obviously, things got back to Nicole, and a lot of house guests just disliked him due to the way he talked to people, so it made him going very easy. At the same time, Jose did have a bunch of allies who weren't loyal to him, and he did show the capability of being a leader, though his reads were very off, and he was way too overconfident. Despite that, I don't actually see him learning from his flaws or improving if he were given another chance, so here he is. At 93rd is Samantha from Big Brother 20. It says a lot that I have an endgamer this low, and from what I can see, there aren't many other endgamers who is anywhere this low. What makes Samantha different than the passive endgamers who does very little is that they are at least in their element playing the game. Samantha clearly had a huge dislike for playing the game, the show, and her mental health decreased exponentially to the point where she quit several times and isolated herself for weeks on end. And the few times she did get power, she based it solely on emotions, refusing to talk game with people, only did what she was told to do with votes, and despite being a goat, the people who were using her abandoned her well before the end game and didn't even take her to the end. There's no capacity to Samantha even wanting to learn from her flaws. She most likely does worse on most seasons with being booted early, and I truly think that she might be the worst endgamer in Big Brother history. The final person in this tier at 92nd is Winston from Big Brother 20. As the season started, it became clear that the preconceived notions people had of him as a player were incorrect. While he was in a solid alliance called the Level 6 Alliance, he was virtually in the bottom of the alliance as his paranoia annoyed the hell out of people, but he was also one of the top targets from the other side, as they all disliked him. Winston was supposed to be the pawn on his final week, but his expendability to his alliance caused him to go home. I also remember him outright rejecting the deal Swikey and Faisal offered him, and he lacked the smoothness and grace Brett had in a lot of situations just in general. I don't think he has what it takes to do well in Big Brother, as he is way too paranoid, poor socially, and not good strategically. The first person in this tier at 91st is Kesar from Big Brother 6, 7, and 22. What is interesting about Kesar is that a lot of people mention that he is a poor player due to his strategy, and I only somewhat agree with that. It is clear that he does not know when to tone it down and when to make a big move, and we saw that on his 2 seasons. But I mainly think his largest flaw in the game comes from his social games, where he is never able to bond with a significant amount of people, and being on the surface nice isn't enough to have a good social game. Him not speaking much caused him to be nominated the first week, and he was never able to form the necessary bonds with the majority of the House. And in All Stars, we saw that even more, as he was more preoccupied with the quote unquote sides dynamic that he and his allies were trying to recreate. In addition to that, a lot of the House guests saw him as arrogant, so that kind of tanked his social game even more. He was able to pull off the good move with his season 6 HOH, but I think it was mainly due to the twist of the duos that caused that to happen. When you think about the growth that he had, or that he could have had due to having a 14-year gap between seasons, not only did he come back to do the same thing that got him booted early on his 2 other seasons, but he actively got worse and was more stubborn, socially awkward, and short-sighted with how he viewed things. And it's even worse because he was in his mid-20s when he played his prior seasons, where he's now a father, a husband, and an early 40-year-old. So clearly there's change and growth in him as a person, just not as a player. It just shows that no matter what dynamic or atmosphere he is in, he's just going to play very poorly and doesn't have what it takes to make it to Jerry. At 19th is Jessica from Big Brother 19. Lord have mercy, I was so close to putting her in the Abysmal tier, and I might still be convinced. The only reason why I didn't is because she generally knows what moves need to be made, which is something that people in that tier don't have. The issue is, Jessica always screws up whenever she has power or needs to make a decision for a plethora of reasons. A lot of the house guests did not like her from the beginning, so she had a very poor social game, and it only got worse when she isolated herself with Cody. She continued to play the game extremely personally when there are actually options for her to stay, but she refused to listen to Josh. She handled her HOH horrendously, and is just in general way too much of a victim to play the way she needs to play or to see other perspectives that might help her as a game player. Due to that, I don't think she would do much better if she were on another season, and in general, it's just a flaw with her personality. Not really anything that she can do to improve as a player, if that makes sense. At 89th is Cameron from Big Brother 19. So from what I remembered of some of the comments that I've seen, some felt like I put him very low on my list, and maybe I wasn't the most fair. If the day one twist was like the others, I probably would have put him higher, but this day one was similar-ish to a normal eviction, and there were a lot more social elements to it. He just didn't seem like he could fit in and was out of his depth socially, so I don't have anything else, so here he is. At 88th is Jocasta from BB16. She was someone who didn't have much room throughout the entire season due to the dynamics of the season, and it caused her to only have some relationships with some of the outsiders. I don't really recall Jocasta strategizing whatsoever in the season, and not even with Donnie, though they both trusted and distrusted the same people. Jocasta was nominated almost every single week due to the Battle of the Block twist, and it seemed like she would be similar to a Victoria pawn, but with Nicole winning HOH, mistakenly nominating her when she really didn't have the numbers, and the big alliance sticking together, Jocasta went home. She was not impressive socially, strategically, or competitively, so I just foresee her remaining bad on any season she is on. At 87th is Victoria from BB16. Honestly, the only difference between herself and Jocasta is that Victoria made it to the end, so she is at least able to be a good goat in that element. Victoria was on the outs from the very beginning, overestimated her relationships throughout the entire season, and overestimated her position throughout the season, which is a really poor trait. Victoria really was not liked by the house guests, which is why she was on the outs, but Derek decided to use her for his own gain, and everyone saw her as unthreatening. So she was just used as a pawn the entire season. Victoria never took action during the season, was poor in competitions, was poor socially, and still have to be saved by a twist to get third, since she would have been fifth without the rewind twist. The self-awareness just isn't there for her to improve as a player or to even know what her flaws are. So here she is at relatively the bottom of this tier. At 86th is Jace from BB17. He was very loud in the house and rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, especially the people who were in power the first week. It did seem like many people prejudged him based on his appearance and one competition, but he didn't mesh well in the dynamics. But if he lasted throughout the week, I do see him becoming a part of the level 6, no, not level 6, the Sixth Sense Alliance. He wasn't aware of how he was coming off to people, even when he was being told it by people. His strategy wasn't the worst, but definitely needed some improvements, and he only did well in one comp. But it's just one competition. I don't see how he could be a good player, but I can see him doing a bit better in other circumstances. But him being a pre-drawer in other seasons wouldn't be out of the realm, in my opinion. At 85th is Ovi from BB21. We are in a string of a bunch of early boots where there's really nowhere else to put them. He tried his very best to fit in with the cast he was put in, but it was impossible for the most part. They all pretty much bashed him relentlessly. I don't recall him having any sort of allies, and while he did have some ideas and had a power, he did not handle it well at all, which only just gave them more of a reason to boot him. Ovi was the replacement nominee by Christie going rogue, so there's an element of him being unlucky, but based on how the season was in that early portion, I don't see him lasting much longer, even if he was not nominated week 1. I could see maybe a few situations where he does well, but there's a lot of situations where I just see him doing just as poorly or around as poorly as he did here. And I don't have enough information to put him any higher, so yeah. At 84th is Steve from BB20. He was pretty unlucky from what I remembered of him in BB20, as Taylor was one of the only people who were eyeing him as a nominee or a target, and he ended up winning HOH. When Steve was nominated, he did have the votes to stay for most of the week, and despite not being in the Falte Alliance, they did want to work with him. Socially, he was close and aligned with Scotty, and kind of isolated himself with Scotty, and not having a relationship with people on the other side. Caitlyn going rogue is why he was booted, and while there's definitely some unluckiness there, I don't really see him doing well in the season anyways, especially with the side he chose. He was way too passive overall and will probably struggle on most seasons in general, so here he is. At 83rd is Jillian from BB19. Again, she is similar to the people who I just spoke about, with being pretty passive during the 1 week she was in the game, and there being some unluckiness that caused her boot. Julian was aligned with outsiders, but she was not able to reintegrate after that. She was nominated against Megan as a pawn, and she would have stayed for sure had Megan not quit the game. She was nominated against Alex and would have stayed had Alex not won the veto. If another outsider was nominated, Julian stays, but because Christmas was nominated besides her, and she was in the alliance that Cody just flipped on, that alliance booted Julian, not only to keep their alliance together, but to piss Cody off. While she was booted due to what other people did instead of what Jillian did, Jillian in general was just way too passive, didn't campaign, and had no idea what was actually happening in the house. Well, I also think she does poorly on most seasons, and even if she did survive this week, based on how the dynamic was in the season, I don't think she would have lasted much longer anyways, or really had much of a chance. At 82nd is Ramses from BB19. He is similar to the other people I discussed over the last few spots, but the main difference is that Ramses was not a first boot and lasted a few rounds and weeks, unlike the others. Ramses was closer to people who were on the outs, like Megan, Jillian, and Alex, and when one of them quit, he never really adjusted. And when Jillian was booted, he didn't adjust at all either. He was not nominated that week, which is good, but Jillian ended up going home, and Ramses was on his own for the rest of his time in the season. He was given a punishment where he had to nominate himself during one of the next few weeks, and when he chose to be nominated, the House was mad that he tried to win the veto because they wanted Cody gone, but in general it was just a very messy situation. When it seemed like he was getting close to Alina and Mark, though I don't think they were going to work with him anyways, Jessica won HOH and poorly used him as a pawn to get Josh out. But because he was not in the big alliance, Paul and Christmas got their votes flipped on him, and Ramses was too passive with how he handled his fate that week. I just don't see him doing well on most seasons due to his social and strategic limitations. At 81st is Brittany from BP16. She is someone that I was disappointed in when I was rewatching the season since I was expecting her to be in the potential tier beforehand. I did not remember how whiny and entitled she was during her time on the season, as she kept on mentioning that her being a mother is why she deserved being there, and acted like she was better than some of the others. She was nominated in the first week, but won Battle of the Block to save herself, and was the target by Devin because of her big mouth. And while some wanted to keep her, it wasn't seemingly enough, but she convinced Devin to keep her safe by mentioning their parenthood. The fact that she did this was good, but it related to her being a parent, which is the main talking point that she is used against the others, or for herself. She pissed off Cody, and once she was targeted the very next week, she really had. Sorry, it wasn't the next week, it was 2 weeks later. She really had nothing left with how she campaigned to stay in the house. Her social game is spotty at best, and while she could have been decent strategically, I think her pride is just too big for her to overcome, and that's a huge issue. At 80th is Bronte from BB18. I think she's the final person on this list, pertaining to the really passive early boots, who also had some unluckiness happening. Bronte was in the group with the other newbies who wanted to target the veterans, or the vet adjacent people, but they of course did not have the numbers to get what they wanted. From that point onwards, Bronte's game was pretty much done, as she was nominated in her final 2 weeks, and while she had her Spy Girls alliance, she didn't have any other relationships, unlike Natalie and Bridget. A lot of the house guests did not like her, which they did not capture on the episodes, and she didn't like them either, which is why her social game suffered severely. On her final week, she was the pawn against Tiffany, but the house flipped on her and she was booted. The social, strategic, and competitive game just wasn't there for Bronte, so here she is. At 79th is David from BB21 and BB22. On his first season, he was booted on the first day because he was banished and couldn't win a competition. I'm not going to talk about Camp Comeback since he wasn't a player at the time, but whatever people felt about his potential in that season completely went away during his second season. David did no research in between seasons about the show at all, and was lucky to have a pre-game alliance with Tyler via Ovi, but he sketched people out the entire season, had horrible read after horrible read, turned off the people that wanted to work with him, and was playing a completely different game than the others. He didn't really know how to communicate with people, and because he didn't like saying for short answers and kind of like talking in riddles at times, it just made people dislike him and have less respect for him even more. Because he was a non threat, he was one of the last non committee people to be taken out. He was poor competitively, poor socially, and poor strategically, where I don't see it getting any better, since there isn't really any self awareness or the care for him to want to do better in a game like Big Brother. 78th is Matt from BB19. Now we're getting to a decent enough line of people who made it to the jury portion of the season, but just had little to no redeeming qualities as a player. Matt actively did not play the game, and when he did decide to do something, it was for Paul's benefit, like keeping himself on the block despite winning the veto while he was nominated. Matt ditched any alliance and relationships that he had in the beginning because of what Paul told him to do, when it would have been beneficial for him to maintain having a relationship with Elena, Mark, hell, even Jessica. And he didn't even have a good enough social game that many people expected, since he refused to speak to the Kevin, Jason, and Alex alliance, despite them being in the same cult. Matt wasn't strong at competitions, wasn't strong socially, and wasn't good at the strategic part of the game, and that was when he did try to play the game. There's also just the lack of care that is also a huge hole for him as a player, so I don't ever see him being an actual player or wanting to learn to be better. At 77th is Raven from BB19. Honestly, she had a lot of the same faults that Matt did. Delusional viewpoint about the game and how involved they really were in the strategizing of the game, as well as their positions in the house, and also not being very social and competitive at all. She abandoned connections to the people that she really needed for her own game, like Jessica, Mark, and Elena, just because Paul told her to, and she never took any action pertaining anything within the game. What makes it even worse is that she had a lot of pointless lies that she told to people about stuff that really didn't matter, but it made a lot of people dislike her, and whatever pity and likability she had due to her health condition in the beginning, that wore thin as the season continued on. She really was in her own world and lacked any sort of self awareness, so I don't see her improving as a player, and her best bet is being dragged to the end as a GOAT. But she couldn't even do that in this season. At 76th is Kevin from BB19, so that's three BB19 people out in a row. What is annoying about Kevin is that there are moments where it seems like he is starting to get into the game, but he would always give it up and just follow whatever Paul wanted with absolutely no hesitation. His entire game was about following Paul and the cult, though half of the cult didn't even like him, and he never even tried to improve those relationships, and while he could have made his own connections and agency within the game, he just gave it up completely, and a lot of the times he just didn't know what he was doing or what was happening. At the same time, he was completely horrendous at competitions, could not utilize any sort of strategy on his own, despite him realizing that things were off throughout the season, and he only made it as far as he did because he was dragged along, and no one respected him. I don't see any improvement as a player if he were to ever come back. At 75th is Faisal from BB20. It's interesting watching him on this season, especially after seeing him on the challenge over the last 4 years, where a lot has changed and a lot has stayed the same with him. Faisal knew very little about the game, but he was able to get into a Falte Hive alliance where they actually had a lot of power in the beginning since they won so many of the HOHs, but they consistently blew it due to the choices that they made and being tricked by the other side. Fisa is someone who needs to be led and isn't very perceptive on what is actually going on, while also struggling socially since he only deals with the people that he likes and doesn't speak to the people that he does not like. Ultimately, his entire alliance crumbled due to the several bad choices they made, and the final nail in their coffin for him was him deciding to target Scotty, who was the only one in his alliance outside of Haley because he didn't like their relationship and believed what the opposite side told him, only to be voted out the very next week. And it's weird that he never even questioned JC about his vote, despite JC disrespecting him time and time again, and also being close to the other side. Faisal just does not get strategy, has a lot of social issues, and only thrives in the competitive aspect. And he has stated that the show/game isn't for him. I don't think he has the ability to improve. At 74th is Victor from BB18. There's no way that someone who was evicted thrice in one season was ever going to be any higher than the bad tier. But even if you look at his three durations, none of them were good. He won immunity on day one, where he would have for sure been the first boot instead of Josiah, because people disliked him so much, and his strategy was so poor, so it wasn't shocking that he was booted second. He was able to skip 2 weeks and had the opportunity to come back, which I docked him for that, but Paul completely led his entire game, where he was led to make a final three with the Pauls, one of them being the person who backdoored him the first time, work with the other guys, and led to turn on Paul and Corey when it wasn't in his best interest to do so. He chose a side when he and Paul were in the middle of the house, and then was immediately turned on the very next week and went home as a mid-juror via being a pawn that went home. He was lucky to get another chance to return, and people usually receive one chance to return, if they even receive that chance at all, so I'm docking him for that too. And he was able to get into an alliance with Nikori, where they all convinced him to take out Natalie, where it was not in his best interest. While Victor did improve socially in the season, and was a threat at the very end, there are a lot of issues here. His strategy is very poor, and the competitions was his only plus. While he might not be as bad on another season, I don't see him improving his falls, and I don't think he has a lot of transferable skills. So, yeah, this tier and this placement is perfectly fine for me. At 73rd is Frank from BB14 and BB18. While the edit seemingly tried to cover it to the best of their ability, Frank's main issue is that his social game was abysmal, which is why most of the house was targeting him from the beginning. He decided to stick himself to Mike Boogie like glue, and the two of them would just bag in their negativity together while thinking that they are in a much better position than they were. Frank was close to going home in the first week, and it was really blowing up that caused him to stay. He was able to win several other HOHs over the course of the season, and some vetoes as well, where he showed how great of a competitor he was. The issue with Frank is that whenever he was not in power, via an HOH, he was nominated, and then had to veto himself. Outside of the first vote, he only survived the block because he was next to Janelle,
And his eviction in the third week was cancelled, so he had the privilege of his eviction being stopped by outside of his control. For someone to get 7th place and was either nominated or HOH is really bad. And Frank always took people's words to heart and by face value too much, when the people proved that they could not be trusted time and time beforehand. With all that in mind, it makes sense why he is here.
Frank returns for Big Brother 18, and it just confirms what I thought about him during Big Brother 14, though I do think his game here might have been better than his first season, due to him not having to rely on not winning competitions for at least a little bit, and he was actually able to be in a majority alliance for the first 2 weeks of the season. This is why he moved up a tier. Pretty much. Despite being positioned great during the first week or so, Frank's personality gets in the way, since he rubs people, pretty much everyone, the wrong way in his alliance, starts to overplay, which everyone sees through, and he starts quite a bit of drama and dissension. He was immune for a few weeks due to his team winning HOHs like Bridget and Polly, so I did dock him for that, and as soon as he was on the block, he was toast, and there wasn't much he could do. His journey here just reinforced his flaws from his first season, but I do give him credit for at least trying to improve, where many people don't even do that on their returning seasons. At 72nd is Swiggy. A part of me thought that he was going to be in the potential tier before rewatching his season, but I just couldn't do it. He caused quite a stir with a few people right from the beginning, though I do think others pushed their perceptions onto him, even if he was not as loud as obnoxious in reality than he was in the diary room. Swaggy was the leader of the Falte side of the house and didn't realize that Tyler wasn't with him, and was very cagey about the people Swaggy was targeting, so that helped his downfall, and him kind of just breaking to others about what he was doing in general. In addition to that, he was not the best at making his allies feel secure with him, which helped Caitlyn flip, and there's a point where Haley and Rockstar even had their doubts about him on the feeds, and they didn't stop his backdoor from happening when they were told about it. Swaggy did have a loyal group of people, and I thought he could do better on another season, but he's still insistent on not changing his flaws and will continue being quote unquote swaggy instead of Christopher, so I can see him being a pre-drawer more often than not. At 71st is Dominique from BB19. She is also someone who, like Swiggy, I did debate about putting in the potential tier, but I just couldn't do it, since I still think she's a bit too limited. Dominique was actually a part of the Babes and Bros alliance that Cody essentially created, and she was in a decent position within the house during the first week and a half of the season. There were notable issues though, like her creating issues between Mark and Elena, where they both wanted to work with her, not developing relationships with people not in her alliance, and focusing on trying to pitch herself a talk show instead of actually playing the game. Paul wanted to create his own cult and decided to not include her in it, where when the Outsiders won HOH, it was easy for her to be targeted. While she knew something was off, especially with Paul, she could not get her point across in the manner that she needed to. I don't really see her improving her skills or really learning anything, so I don't think she would do better on another season. At 70th is Jessica from BB21. I don't think she's the worst of the worst, hence Jessica being on the higher end of the bad tier, but I don't think she's above being a bad player. She immediately did not jive well with the cast and only got along with a few of the women on the cast, but they are either basically just as powerless as she was, had other close ties that were closer than their tie to her, or they were booted very early in the season. Jessica kind of just observed everything that happened, and she did win HOH and Veto in 1 week to take out Jack, but nothing about her actual position in the house changed. So she remained on the bottom and ignored what the dynamics were in the season, with them changing over and over again and trying to make herself fit into those consistently changing dynamics, since they never really included her in those alliances. There are a lot of social holes in Jessica's game that needs to be improved on, and I don't think she was really good strategically or competitively, so she's either booted early again or dragged along, but she didn't even get to be a goat in the season. She is following Big Brother heavily and she's involved in the community, so if there was a case of her returning season she comes back, maybe she could surprise me and do better, but in general, I kinda doubt it. At 69th is Jason from BB17. He is another person that I was expecting to put in the potential tier, but he just fell short. Jason was one of the winners of the first HOH competition, so it caused him to build his power structure and to give himself an advantage in the season. The issue is, the group that he got together was not strong at all, and he didn't encourage them to stick together, and he lost all power after the first week. He was nominated for every single week until he was eventually booted in the late pre-jury, spent most of his time smoking cigarettes to trash talk people, ignored half the house when it came to game talk, blabbed to everyone about the twin twist, believed Clay and Shelley even when they backstabbed him and his alliance time and time again. He got outplayed in his final week and really did very little to save himself. I don't see him improving or being a better player on another season, so here he is. At 68th is Devon from BB17, BB18, and BB22. This is going to be a long one, since I never had to talk about one person who did 3 seasons in a single era before. So, in the first season, Devon gained immunity in the first week and was able to get into the majority alliance with the HOH at the time. With this in mind, she should have just been relaxing and cruising, right? Nope. She alienated Shelley, picked a fight with Clay, and tried to have him kicked out of the alliance, had some drama with Audrey, and got way too paranoid, to the point where she was immediately taken out the very next week with no resistance. And then she did not handle the twin situation or the vote situation well at all. Devon comes back for BB18, and she's the one veteran that the newbies on the other side actually trust, while she was in good with the other vets and the newbies who wanted to work with the vets. She was in the 8-person alliance, was in the Fatal Five, was approached to work with Zali and Nikori, and things were going well for her. Until she screwed it up. Turning on Tiffany due to her own paranoia, when she would have been loyal to her, was not a flex at all, though Tiffany's social game was on a decline with her without Devon, and continuing a beef with Frank was also not good for her, though he was always in a worse social position than she was. I don't think the Tiffany or Frank stuff was her actual downfall though, but it was her neglecting certain relationships, like neglecting her relationship with a very vengeful and needy Polly, and not being aware of why she was telling the information to who people like James and what his perspective on certain stuff would have been like. And when she wanted to go against Nicole, which people knew about for a few weeks at this point, she didn't have the numbers, but she still had a decent amount of allies, and the HOH didn't even want her gone that week. On BB22, Devon should have done well, since she was on a recent season, so they knew her. She had some outside the game connections with some of the people in the cast that would have helped her, and she's not a threat or a target at all. She gets into an alliance called the Slick Six that isn't a real alliance, but it very well could have been real had she or Betty won in HOH, and the alliance still kept her safe for the first few weeks when people like Tyler and Enzo won HOHs. What also made it a fake alliance was that she was consistently telling people that she needed to, quote unquote, fact check when they just wanted her to take their word for certain information that they were relaying to her. She cannot vote out people because they are black, ignoring that most of the cast was white, and obviously they would feel uncomfortable with this. Completely ignore people who are trying to get her as a number, which she desperately needed in the season Nick did not encase her, and picked fights with some of the few people she actually had, like David and somewhat Kevin. She was perceptive in her first 2 seasons, but that skill set was completely gone in her third season, and it was very painful to watch, though Devon finally won a competition. She's a mess strategically, despite being perceptive, can't be social, but is just in general too distrusting to let her social game work for her, and is very poor competitively, causing her to be here, especially after having 3 chances. At 67th is Rockstar from BB20. I'm kinda shocked that she isn't lower on this list, but I guess the others are just bigger screw ups. Rockstar was able to get into the Fate Alliance and was pretty well positioned within that alliance, though she had absolutely no game with anyone on the other side, or any relationship with them, and had a contentious relationship with Brett, so she didn't have much options. There were times where Rockstar came off like the smarter person in the alliance, but she was not an equipped leader or a natural leader, when maybe that would have been the case and they would have done better had she been the leader. She let her emotions get to her at various points in the season, and while she was screwed in her final week, her giving Tyler the veto answer when she could have saved herself otherwise that week is just catastrophic. At the same time, I see this season as her best case scenario, where I think she'll do worse in other seasons slash scenarios. She's poor strategically, poor socially with the exception of the people she's close to, and is poor in competitions, so I can't put her on a higher tier. At 66th is Scotty from BB20. He is another person that I'm shocked is this high on this tier, but it's not because he's much better than the people lower than him on this tier. Scotty was kind of not in the Fate Alliance, and while he was a number for them, they didn't have the most trust with him, and he spent most of his first week with Steve, who went home that week. Scotty had to readjust and then got closer to the fatty side of the house, and while he did take out Winston and arguably had the best HOH from everyone on his side of the house in the entire season, his side of the house still did not trust him, especially with the swaggy vault mess while wearing his t-shirt. Scotty was very poor socially, as people on the other side did not want to speak to him at all, and his own side thought that he was too much. I do think he was the best person strategically on his alliance, but it doesn't say much, since he still failed to see the bigger picture at many points in the season, but he just wasn't chaotic. Faisal, his own ally, targeted him on his HOH, and Scotty virtually did nothing. He then came back into the game only to be booted 6 days later, too, so I docked him for all of that, too. Scotty's biggest issue in the game are his social skills, since he isn't horrible strategically and he's competent enough in competitions, but people are just too sketched up by him, and he has an issue with taking accountability for his shortfalls, as we saw with his many explanations and excuses post season and in the years since, so I can't see him improving as a player. At 65th is Zach from BP16. I don't know how people feel about Zach as a player, but I saw very little that is good about him as a player when I rewatched the season. He was close to some of the people who ended up in the Palm Squad Alliance, and while I don't feel like he did much wrong with the Devon situation, he still found himself in a sticky situation, and his allies were considering booting him that week, which isn't good, and he stayed due to nothing of his own doing. Zach liked agitating people and doing things for TV time, which sketched everyone out, even his closest allies. I believe he created the Detonators Alliance, or maybe just named it, but he had no control over the alliance and was kind of hostile to a lot of people in the house, while also creating bad relationships with people like Christine. He also went home during the first week at jury. Actually, he almost went home during the first week at jury, and his allies were voting him out, but stayed true to a last minute flip that he had absolutely nothing to do with. Zach then ended up finally going home in a week where he should have been safe, but because he was so low on the totem pole and he talked way too much, it was easy for his allies to boot him. He was pretty poor strategically, wasn't notable in competitions from what I remember, and is actively poor socially, and I don't see him improving as a player, especially with everything he went through postseason, and I don't think he can really handle the game. If he toned it down, I might have moved him up another tier, but I think his run here is the best case scenario. At 64th is Bridget from BB18. When it comes to Bridget, many people don't really think about her as a player at all, which had me wondering how I would feel about her as a player before rewatching the season. Unfortunately, I didn't get much good from her after rewatching the season. She was a part of the Spy Girls, which is a good thing, and was loosely attached to the anti-red newbies, but she wasn't close with the other side either, so she didn't have many people. Bridget had the chance to better her position in the game with winning an early HOH, but instead of going with her gut to target Nicole and Corey, she let Frank completely talk her into making poor nominations and letting him talk her out of vetoing Bronte, her closest ally, who he also secretly nominated, only for the latter to go home on her HOH. Bridget was on the outs for the rest of the season, where she was soon nominated with Frank and was consistently nominated until she was booted. She stayed over Frank and Devon due to nothing of her own doing. Bridget did help make the game-changing move of booting Zakia to weaken Polly, and also making amends with former enemy Michelle, but she had a poor HOH result in Corey, which caused her to not benefit from the move. I still think she suffers socially and strategically, but she's better in competitions than I remember, so her being at the relative top of this tier is fitting to me. And the final person in this tier at 63rd is Bailey from Big Brother 20 and Big Brother 22. For her entire journey on Big Brother, and while I was watching her 2 seasons, I kept on debating about what tier I should put her in, whether in the bad tier or the potential tier, but her being at the top of the bad tier is very fitting now, looking back. In her first season, she was actually closer to the level 6 side of the house, before drifting more to the Fateh side of the house, while not actually joining that side officially until a few weeks in. She actually had good relationships with both sides of the house, and was kind of playing in the middle, though I don't think she was intending on, or was even aware, or actively playing the middle, or else she would have leaned more into it. Things fell apart for Bailey once she won HOH, where she had to piss people off with the nominations and winning her spot in the house, and she arguably had the worst HOH-itis ever, as she treated everyone poorly, refused to listen to anyone or understand their perspectives, which would have actually given her some more insight, and was way too bossy, while also telling Rachel her power. Her HOH was a failure, and then she was backdoored the following week, where she handled that very poorly because of her for estimating some of her relationships. In her next season, she was calmer than she was in her first season, and it seemed like she was in a decent position as well, as people wanted her to be in the committee alliance, and she was close to the Janelle side of the house as well. Unfortunately, she was not put into the alliance because of her connection to Devon, and she also let Devon pull her away from working with Janelle and Kaiser. Once again, Bailey overestimated her relationships with people, which we saw with Christmas, so not only does she ignore others about them warning her about her real position in the house, but she took it really personally when Christmas nominated her. She really did nothing to stay that week, and her bragging about being a better juror sealed her fate. Ultimately, Billy does not handle it well when things don't go her way. She overestimates her relationships as she's too trusting and just really doesn't understand the game. Despite having some signs that she could do better if she grew as a player or became more knowledgeable, but I don't think she has that capability or the skill set to actually improve as a player and to have any sort of self awareness. So the first person in this tier at 62nd is Kemi from BB21. Honestly, Kemi's only on this tier because I really don't have much information about her skill set as a player. She was making alliances with people, so I can't say she was underplaying, but she wasn't overplaying either, with making too many alliances, spreading too much information, and just making a bunch of awful moves. She was not well liked in the house, and while I do somewhat fault her for this, there was a lot of racist commentary that was made about her and was used as justification, so it came off more like it was racism more than her own personality. Due to the toxic atmosphere and her not doing a whole lot wrong, I could see her doing better in another situation, but it's also why she is low on this tier, because it's kind of a stretch as well. At 61st is Glenn from BB18. He suffered from the day 1 to day 2 twist, where they boot someone right at the beginning of the season, but it's usually not by the normal means. It caused for Glenn to be eliminated after losing 4 competitions essentially, which sealed his fate. There's no social or strategic elements to his elimination, which is why I put him in this tier, but based on him siding with the anti-vet newbies and being an older player, I don't think he would have done well on the season anyways, and I don't know if he has the skill sets to do better on other seasons. At 60th is Amber from BB16. She's a tough one for me to talk about since, due to the dynamics of the season, no woman really had a chance in that season. At the same time, she was able to get into the Bomb Squad Alliance for 2 or 3 weeks, but she was brought in randomly by Devon without the approval of most of the Alliance, so they didn't really want her in it to begin with. She did build some relationships with people, but there were a lot of others that disliked her, despite her not really doing what people accused her of doing. But it's a perception issue. Amber was by far the strongest competitor out of the women that season, and she was definitely catching on to the game as it happened, realizing what needed to be done, but she was backdoored brutally. Now, knowing that a lot of her social awkwardness was due to her being neurodivergent, which was undiagnosed at the time, I think people would understand her more in the future, and I do see her improving strategically and competitively on other seasons, since she is already picking up the game in a pretty good fashion. At 59th is Jeff from BB17. There's not much camera time given to Jeff during the season, and I think he's arguably the most forgettable person in the entire season, which is why a lot of people in general don't talk about his game. Jeff kinda did end up with the James and Jason side of the house, but he did have good relationships with people on the other side, like Clay, Shelly, and Liz, so he could have easily found himself in the middle spot had he known more about the game in general. At the same time, he was a sloppy player since he did speak too much, came off like a Carl salesman in most of his conversations, and he kind of had issues with Austin, who was obviously a strong game player in the season. He was picking up on the game quickly and was pretty influential, which is why the Sixth Sense Alliance took him out when they did, and he was also able to gain more votes than he should have with his soft campaign during his final week, so he's very persuasive. I do think if he lasted longer, or was on another season, he could do some serious damage, so I feel good about him. At 58th is Tiffany from BB18. When it comes to people who are hard to discuss, I think Tiffany is the toughest one to discuss for a few reasons. One is that her sister's reputation is such a hard one to overcome, and it doesn't help that her season was right after her sister's season, so there's no room for people to move on or to have time to move on, so Tiffany could have her own perception in the game. People assumed that she would be a mastermind before she even did anything, and the pre-gaming against Vanessa, if the latter was on the season was just too much for Tiffany to overcome. Tiffany was well positioned at first, and while some of her downfall was due to outside factors, I do think that her social skills were pretty poor, and a lot of the house guests did dislike her without the influence of Frank or Devon, so it wasn't just the two of them planting poison against her. She seemed to be pretty competent strategically, from what I could see at least, pertaining to the dynamics of the house, and was willing to put her ego aside to make new alliances and make moves, which she did several times, so I do respect her for that, and that's a skill set that a lot of people don't have. I think in another season, she could grow as a player and do quite a bit better, especially since Vanessa is not so fresh in people's mind anymore. At 57th is Sam from BB21. He is another person on this tier that is a pretty forgettable house guest when it comes to personality and gameplay. From what I remembered of him, he was not a part of the Grateful Alliance, but had decent relationships with a good amount of the people in the Alliance, which is why he was kind of the ninth person in that alliance. At the same time, he never really caught on strategically, despite being in a decent enough position, and the closest people who he was with in that alliance were Nick and Isabella, two people on the bottom, so he can never be the Polly of the BB18 or Enzo of BB22 or JC in BB20, where they weren't in the alliance, but they were able to infiltrate it so well. He just didn't have that skill set. Sam won a few vetoes that he did nothing with, which built his target up, and he ended up being the pawn that went home after Nick won the veto. And while he was close to staying, it had nothing to do with anything he was actually doing or anything he was campaigning. I don't think he's a bad or good player and had some promise, so here he is in this tier. The final person in this tier at 56th is Rachel from BB20. She's another one that I find confusing, not only because she herself is a very forgettable player and house guest, but she didn't do much of anything to be placed in the bottom two tiers. Rachel was in the level 6 alliance, which was the strategically superior alliance, but it was mainly due to the work that Tyler did, rather than anyone else. In the alliance, Rachel was another one of those people who were at the bottom of the alliance, and she didn't realize it until she was literally on her way out the door, like after being evicted. At the same time, she was one of the people in our alliance that did have better relationships with the other side, though she didn't do much with it and she wasn't working with any of them, and had a good enough head on her shoulders when it comes to strategy. I could see her doing better on other seasons, as she was a big fan of the show, and she has a good enough head on her shoulders, and she ended up going home due to her alliance having it out for her in a worst case scenario. But I don't know about that for sure, or I can't be too sure about it because she was very paranoid, and that was the main reason why her allies were so turned off by her. So the first person in this tier at 55th is Nicole Anderson from BB21 and BB22. In her first season, there was always a sense of doubt about whether she made it far on her own merit, or if it was because everyone kind of just left her alone, as well as the house getting bad for her due to being the quote unquote right victim. Nicole was on the outs during the first few weeks as she aligned with the people that were not long for the game, and it seemed like she would be on her way out early in the third week. But Nick and Isabella's unlikable personalities caused their own allies to save her. One, she didn't know she was staying, and with that in mind, she did nothing that caused her to stay that round. After that, she got closer to Cliff, and they stayed out of the fray for the next several weeks to let the bigger targets take one another out. She and Cliff aligned with Jackson and Ollie, which single-handedly brought them all to the endgame, where she was in the final three with a showman and lost to them. Nicole entered her second season, mentioning that she's going to follow her gut, which she did not do in her first season, which caused her to be a second boot, since she had no idea of the dynamics in the house, got it all wrong, was a social outcast, and just had a really bad run. Her poor social, strategic, and not strong competitive skills are why she's at the relatively bottom of this tier. At 54th is Janelle from BB6, BB7, BB14, and BB22.
For someone who made it to third place twice, Janelle should be a lot higher and should be in a completely different tier altogether, but when you look at her two games, it is middling at best. Janelle's issues came from not having a good social game in both seasons, as the other house guests saw her as extremely snobbish and uptight, where it alienated her from a lot of the house guests, and the same thing happened in Big Brother 7 as well, though there are pre-game alliances and elements that came into place. She was able to eventually find an alliance, but it caused her to only want to work in the sides dynamic, which shows that she's very unadaptable, but she was able to do well in that dynamic. The difference in Big Brother 6 is that she didn't rely on competitions to make it that far, or to make it far, where she absolutely needed to win competitions for sure in order to make it far in Big Brother 7, or else she would have been an early boot. Janelle also played emotionally throughout the 2 seasons, and whatever strategic potential she had was thwarted due to it, where it was just due to personal revenge in Big Brother 6, and she was being manipulated by, well, in Big Brother 7. Despite that, she did perform well on 2 seasons, and very well could have won one of them, but the skill set is lacking despite her placement on those seasons. I will say that Janelle did improve as a player regarding giving up the notion that competitions were the only things that mattered. You need to kiss butts to the people in power at times, and you do need to float at times. Unfortunately for her, the improvements she made in the game and strategy did not matter, since her reputation preceded her and the house were full of non-fans, so her reputation could also be twisted as well. And the biggest issue for Janelle in Big Brother has always been social, and that element unfortunately did not improve.
What else is there to say about Janelle? She came into her 4th season with a big target on her back, despite pre-gaming, wanted to create an us versus them situation, ignored her instincts due to Kesar, and was very vocal about targeting Nicole, who had a lot of allies in this season. She continued to have a poor social game, and while she wasn't completely wrong strategically, she had no clout to execute what she wanted and needed to make happen. And the competitiveness in the competitions weren't there, yet again. At the bottom of middling as a player, but that was the case even before this season. At 53rd is Julia from BB17. I really don't have much to say about Julia, as she's in a similar predicament that Natalie was in during BB5. She came in as an extension of her sister, where she had to hide her identity for most of the pre-jury phase when she was there, so when she came in as her own player, that shadow was already on her. Unlike Natalie, who didn't have much time to prove herself on her own, Julia did have that time and was very unimpressive. She and Liz were very passive in general, but Julia really did very little as a player, and while she might have been a bit more social, she had no agency and she didn't contribute strategically, and she was a lot worse competitively than her sister. What Julia did do when she had her own agency was do bad things, like choosing Austin in a vital veto competition, ruining all the chances of the 3 of them making it through the week, and then telling everyone to vote her out when she was on the block. She just doesn't have what it takes to be a decent player, and is lucky that she isn't in the bad tier. At 52nd is Donnie from BB16. He is someone that I struggled with, pertaining whether I should put him in the mediocre tier or the bad tier, and honestly there are arguments for both. He was a target from the very first week, and the fact that he was able to become a major is kind of impressive in that element. At the same time, he did nothing to integrate himself with the house and to make important connections, as outside of Jocasta, he only started connecting with people who are on their way out of the house, which was essentially pointless. Donnie did have a good read on the house and wanted to make a move, but that means nothing when you are really poor socially, and it's by choice as well. He was good in the competitions, which would be a plus for him, but it also showed that he needed those competitions to make it far, or else he would have been an early boot. I do see him more often than not being an early boot on other seasons, so I have to put him on the lower end of the mediocre tier, despite some of his positives. At 51st is Elena from BB19, another person who I considered putting in one of the 2 lower tiers, but I don't think she played horribly, and I don't think she has any notable potential or was robbed, or me really being confused about her gameplay in any way. Elena got into what was the majority alliance at the time, which centered around Cody, and it was in her best interest for that alliance to stay together. Of course, she kissed up to Paul because he was a vet and seemed a lot more stable compared to Cody and Jessica. It was something that the rest of the house did, but unfortunately for her, they turned on herself and Mark because they were quote unquote close to Jessica and Cody, and she was essentially used to get Dominique out. Despite all of the evidence, Elena did her best to kiss up to the group that kicked her out, but it did her nothing and she was still an early jury boot. Obviously, Elena is just a middling player who doesn't have much faults or skills in general, so being at the bottom of this tier is fitting. At 50th is Catherine from BB21. She is someone who definitely reminded me a lot of Elena in the sense of kissing up to a group of people who did not want her, but I do think she has a bit more game sense and potential compared to Elena. Catherine was the initial target for a bit during the first week, and it was outside factors that caused the target to shift. She did have her allegiances to Jackson and Holly, which had some pre-game elements, and was also close to the likes of Jessica and somewhat Cliff and Nicole. But people just saw her as kind of annoying and untrustworthy, so she never really gained much traction. It seemed like she had the right reads at the time, and she was playing people against one another without her intention, but I do think she spent a lot more time fighting to get camera time, and that was where a lot of her focus during the season went into. Ultimately, the tide started to change mid-season, and she did almost go home at the end of the pre-jury, but things changed up, though it didn't really change up quick enough for her, as Tommy, the main one who wanted things to stay the same, won power to take her out. Due to her getting more familiar with Big Brother after her season, I could see her doing better if she was on another season, since she is learning a lot, so I see that as an upside for her. At 49th is Jack from BB21. For some reason, I thought he would be a bit higher on my list before actually rewatching this season, but I thought less of him as a player, not less as a person, since I can't really think worse in that element. Jack was running the house with the Grateful Alliance, and he did have a strong hold amongst the house. But the issue is, everyone knew it, and it became more clear to me that he was really used as a shield instead of influencing everyone by his own allies, and he used a lot of threatening/intimidating factors to keep control of people. Jack did not speak much to people from the other side of the house, which is bad socially, and they all planned on targeting him, where even people on his own side were thinking about targeting him, which I think that was the case with Nick before he won his HOH. Jack contributed in his alliance breaking up when he benefited hugely from not only just his alliance, but specifically Jackson and Chrissy staying together, and he went home right afterwards. Jack was better in competitions than I remember, but he was a mixed bag socially and was not strong strategically, so here he is. At 48 is Haley from BB20. She is someone that is one of the more competent members of her alliance, just because she does have a social game, which she, unfortunately for her, didn't use to her advantage, and was not a complete dodo when it comes to strategy. Both sides of the house liked her, but she stuck with the Falte side, and eventually lost her connections with the other side. So it showed a naivete pertaining her game. Haley had a lot of opportunities to change things with her alliance, like stopping the Swanky back door. She would unfortunately just let things happen, and she's someone who would have benefited her alliance more and herself had she been a leader and had better game for all of them to thrive, but she just isn't a natural leader. Then there was her moment of spilling that she was the hacker out of guilt, which accomplished absolutely nothing, and then helping Faisal turn on Scotty. Haley definitely was competent enough in competition at times, and she has room to grow strategically and socially, so I can't see her improving on another run, since she was very young when she did this season, but I don't have too much faith in her, hence her being on the lower end of this tier. At 47th is Caleb from Baby 16. I hate that he's even this high on the list, though he is on the lower end of the mediocre tier. Caleb was a part of the Bomb Squad Alliance because he was the first HOH and got close to Devin, and he was at the bottom of that alliance, to the point where he was not even included in the new version of the alliance, which would become the Detonators. Caleb would only be kept around because they knew that they could manipulate him to do whatever. So even if he was not in the alliance, Caleb was good at competitions and would never adapt them, so he became a subsidiary. So he made several different moves that were not in his best interest, never even tried to play self-interestedly, his social game was really poor, and he had very little awareness about anything in the game. I don't see him improving as a player due to his faults as a player, and I can honestly see him doing worse more often than not, which is why he is in this position. At 46th is Meg from BB17. Is there even much to say about her as a player? She herself has said that she knew nothing about what was going on strategically throughout the season and was consistently left out of the loop. She did get in close with the Jason and James side of the house and stuck with them for the entire season, even though it was clear that they were on the losing side. Despite that, she was pretty well liked by the other side of the house, which is one of the reasons why they did avoid targeting her until there's no one else. But another factor is that she was such a huge non-threat. Meg was not good in competitions or strategy, and she was borderline horrible in competitions. Luckily, her social skills bumped her up to this tier, and I don't ever see her going due to this, but she just doesn't have what it takes to be anything but a bit below average player, and she never used her social game to her advantage, as much as she could have. At 45th is Alex from BB19. She's a very frustrating person to talk about as a player. In the beginning, she was not in a good position since she was with a group of people who are on the out of the house, and she would have went home in week 1 had she not won the veto. After that, I do think that it is impressive that she was able to get into the majority alliance after that, and thought that she worked that in an impressive way, or that's what I thought. Afterwards, Alex just blindly believed Paul shut down any thought Jason or Kevin had, which would have benefited all of them and their games, and she was really poor strategically. Socially, she was a mixed bag from what I remembered, and was very good in competitions, but she was only really good saving grace. Alex made bad move after bad move because she wanted to lose the season so she could come back as a returning player, and we saw how that went out for her. Alex in general did not have the right priorities and thought she knew a lot more than she really did. So despite some good qualities, she really held herself back from being an upper tier player with her faults. At 44th is Michelle from BB18. I thought that she was going to be a bit higher or lower on the tier, but I think placing her in around the middle of this tier and the middle of this list is kind of fitting, since Michelle has quite a bit of good and bad traits. Michelle was one of the few newbies who was able to get into a good position with the veterans and got in that majority alliance, while not being a target for the other newbies. At the same time, she did just stick with her alliance for the first half of the season, and she didn't really build much relationships with people outside of that. So when that structure started falling apart in the middle of the season, with Devon being booted, Michelle struggled. She did get to work and got some votes so she could stay, but then she went back to being passive once she got with James and Natalie, which would eventually cause her boot. Especially when she mismanaged her HOH from not targeting Nicole and Corey into targeting Victor and Paul. Michelle did have her moments where she was good strategically and can make things happen, as I do think she was one of the major reasons as to why Tiffany stayed in the third week. But she was more often than not way too emotional and complacent for me to put her in one of the three upper tiers. At 43rd is Annalise from BB21. A part of me is shocked that she ended up being this high on the list, though she really isn't high on the list overall when you think about it, and especially when I eventually combine the 3 or 4 eras. The thing with Annalise is that she is someone who will rarely be booted pre-jury, as she is going to find a way to be a part of the majority alliance since she is quote unquote popular, a follower, and passive, so very little faults in that regard. Most people will not find it worth it for her to be targeted, and she will be someone who is a good supporting ally. She wasn't active in the strategy and honestly seemed confused a lot of the time, but she did have some vital relationships with people that didn't keep her on the outs. Things did not go well for her once the Sixth Alliance blew up, and she was initially the pawn in her final week, but she was too passive to campaign against Christie, which caused her to get the boot. She's just a prime example of a middle of the road player. At 42nd is Zakia from BB18. I put her on the same level and ability as Annalise pretty much, which is why they are back to back. Zakia is someone who is always going to be in the majority alliance, and I rarely ever see her getting booted pre-jury. She is not a leader and is a fine enough supporting ally for a more alpha person to bounce the ideas off of and to lead off of. The main issue with Zakia is that she is way too passive and comfortable in her position, where she is so stuck on her alliance to the point where she does not build relationships with people outside of her alliance. Once those dynamics shifted, Zakia really couldn't adapt, and while her downfall was mainly due to her association with certain allies who are very bad, mainly Devon and Polly, her passivity also made it very easy for others to boot her, especially since she lacked those relationships with people she wasn't working with. Zakia isn't emotional and keeps it together more, which are good traits, but there's just not enough that would have me higher on her as a player, outside of being a mid player, though I can see her doing better on other seasons regarding ranking and placement. At 41st is Mark from BB19. I think Mark is someone who could have shown to be a better player if he was on another season or another dynamic that was more flexible. Of course, he was in the big alliance with Cody, only for the latter to completely blow it up, so he flipped with everyone else. Mark did kiss up to Paul like the rest of the house, but there were several moments where he showed some signs of self-interest and wanted to make his own allies and moves, which is more than what a lot of people did on this season. Unfortunately for him, he did come off as shady when Cody and Jessica came back, and he tried to float, which he outright admitted, but was not successful at it. He got very emotional at several points in the season, and while he was close to making the necessary moves, it didn't all come together, and he was a bit too passive and awkward at times as well. Mark is a decent enough competitor, decent enough strategy wise, and decent enough socially, so he is here on this tier and on this placement. Though if he were to return, I could see him potentially becoming a solid player or just remaining the same. At 40th is Jackie from BB17. There really isn't a lot for me to say about Jackie. One of the reasons is that she was generally very under-edited on the show, and from the feeds, she was not doing a whole lot. But when we did see her on the show, or paid attention to her on the feeds, she definitely came off as a more capable player compared to almost everyone else in her alliance, as she was starting to put things together regarding the dynamics. I also think that due to her lack of knowledge on Big Brother in general, she couldn't put it all together and she was not the most confident in her skill set. Socially, I think she was okay. Strategically, I think she was coming into her own, but wasn't fully there. She was also okay competitively. Her being taken out before she got the chance to really rise as a player or really do anything is significant, or do anything significant, is why she is where she is on this list. At 39th is Nick from BB21. He is someone who is definitely a mixed bag in my opinion, which shows in his trajectory throughout the season. Nick was a part of the Grateful Alliance, which was running things in the first 2 weeks, but they got annoyed with him and were planning on turning on him, but he won HOH. He ignored Nicole's warnings about his own alliance, and they ended up flipping on him that same week. Despite that, and a few of his allies going home, he ended up back in a good position, which he had little to do with, but he recognized it and tried to use it towards his advantage. But his martyr mentality got in the way, and people caught on to what he was doing. Nick is pretty good in competitions from what I remember, had some sense of strategy, and knew what he needed to do. But the execution is the issue, and he was able to build strong bonds with people, but his messiness got in the way of that, and his actions do piss a lot of people off, so he's all over the place, but I didn't find it fitting to put him in the tier above or below this one. At 38 is Christine from BB16. It's crazy because I never imagined that she would be this high on the tier ranking when I rewatched her season, but I guess she isn't that high if we are really looking at all 7 tiers. Christine was in the Bomb Squad Alliance by accident via Devin going rogue, so she could have been like all the other women if he didn't do that. But Christine was one of the few who was actively engaged in the game, as she got close to Nicole and was also close to Hayden in the beginning, where she was trying to balance both of her alliances. At the same time, she became more and more subservient to the Detonators alliance, knowing that she was at the bottom of her alliance. Despite having that information and knowing it, and I do give her props for actually having enough self-awareness to realize that, Christine never actively did anything to change it, like improving her relationships with people in her alliance, or really using the Nicole's to make a move against her alliance that would have helped her agency in the game. Christine's social game was pretty poor, and she was okay in the other elements, so that's why she is in this tier, since I only see her doing similarly or worse on other seasons. At 37th is Jason from BB19. He is another person who is just very frustrating for me to talk about when it comes to his skills as a gamer. The main reason why I'm frustrated when thinking of him is because Jason had the potential to at least be a solid player. Out of everyone on the cast, he had one of the best social games out of everyone on the season, but he never really used it to his advantage, where he could have been safe on all ends and used his influence to really benefit his own game. But he was always kowtow to Alex and then be gutted to always make the move that Paul wanted to make, or just follow Paul, which was to Jason's detriment, and his allies were very aware of this, or all of them but Alex, in that cult. I will say that Jason was very lucky to not be booted first, since he would have been nominated if it wasn't for Cody going rogue. Jason is great in competitions, had a solid enough social game, and had room to grow strategically, but his lack of confidence and general passivity knocked him to be in the mediocre tier. At 36th is John from BB17. I never got the reason why people hyped him up so much, especially as a player, since from what I saw, there was really nothing there. In the beginning of the season, he was mainly close with Becky and Steve, and had the need to want to work with Clay and Shelly, though it was clear that they were just taking advantage of and using him, especially in those early weeks. While I do give him props for seeing through Vanessa, I also think that was something that a lot of the cast was also coming to grips with on their own, so I don't know if that's really a special trait with him. From what I can recall, John is just an agreeable presence where people feel comfortable enough with him despite him not really being a social person. He ended up going the first time because most of the opposition was booted, but he did get in close enough with Vanessa, so when he returned, they had a working relationship, but a lot of that was done because they knew a returnee competition was coming. John is very good at competitions and was okay in the other two areas, but there's nothing here that indicates that he is an upper tier player. At 35th is James from BB17 and BB18. For someone who is a returnee and did quite well on both of his appearances, I really don't have a whole lot to say about James, and it's because he's really stagnant. I will say that I do think he ran his first HOH on BB17 pretty well, as he set up an alliance and sent someone home that most people in the house didn't really care about. The issue is, the alliance he put together was erratic and dysfunctional at best and pretty stupid at worst. So they continuously lost people after his HOH reign, and he really didn't know what was happening in the house. He almost went home in the third week and stayed due to nothing of his own doing, and it took James winning his second HOH where his alliance finally started getting things correct, for at least a bit. James would break his deal to Clearly to split them up, which he did to Frank and Bridget in the following season, so consistency there. Sent home Shelley in an emotional move over a t-shirt when Vanessa going would have benefited him in his alliance, and he was kept around due to his relationships with the Oz twins and due to being a non-threat, but was booted when the rest of the house just was in an alliance and there was no one else. In BB18, he was pretty much the same player, though his main alliance was more stable here than in BB17, and he shut down all the blind sides, so he would not piss people off. Though in this season, you could clearly tell that he is more focused on trying to win AFP than really play the game to the best of his ability. At the same time, people started losing respect for him this season because he always made the safe move, was seen as a rat, and really just did what people told him to do, so he wouldn't even be a jury threat at the end. James is someone who really doesn't get strategy. I can't say he's good in competitions, since he only does well in endurance competitions, and has a competent enough social game, so I think he performs pretty similarly in every season. At 34th is Kevin from BB11 and BB22.
He is someone whose game I ended up lowering on after the rewatch. It seemed like he was only really close to Shima and Lydia, and while the alliance with the former brought him into the Jesse side of the house, he was at the bottom of that alliance, and it seemed like Lydia had the better relationships with the other side of the house. Before that obviously went to kaput. He did work on his relationships and intentionally laid under the radar, and didn't end up using the veto on Lydia on Shima's HOH, as she was safe, but sometimes it's best to just use the veto on your ally. The reason why I ended up lowering on Kevin is that I didn't realize how lucky he was with the coup d'etat, since it was able to better his position in a way that the dynamics was not leading up to otherwise, as he was able to vote out Jesse, and it's a good move, or it's good that he realized that he needed to take that shot at that time. He was on the chopping block sooner than later, and the twist changed that. He was able to work closely with Natalie in the second half of the season due to that, and they were able to kind of play Jeff. At the same time, I questioned his choice in wanting to take Jordan to the end over Natalie, and it showed that the awareness isn't completely there. I think Kevin gets the strategy, social, and competitiveness, since he did do well in a lot of the competitions before he actually started winning them, but I think he had a blind spot against strength archetypes, and had some slightly off reads at several times in the season, while getting lucky with the Q.
Due to how people perceived him during BB11, many people were excited to see him come back, since it has been a decade since he last played and really wasn't connected to the alumni in general. Kevin came into the house and was immediately nominated because many people did not know who he was, and it was clear that Kevin was a lot more emotional this season, and I think he let it affect his gameplay overall. He spent 2 weeks talking in a whirlwind circle with Nicole A about their poor reads, and then he got closer to the likes of Devon, Bailey, and David, who not only did that group not really get along, but they never really knew what was going on in the house. He was consistently pawned during the season, and there was really no path for him in the game, despite him lasting about 2 months into the season. I think that Kevin in this season was close to how he would have been in BB11 without the coup, as he does struggle to fit in with most groups and is very insecure, which blinds him, and was poor strategically in the season while being weaker in competitions. So, yeah, it definitely bumped him down a lot on my rankings. At 33rd is Ian from BB14 and BB22.
He had a lot of chances and things outside of his control that helped him get as far as he did. Boogie needed to save him with the immunity, where he was going to be on the block otherwise in the first week, and could have easily been voted out in the first week. And then there's the double veto, which he ended up finding in that box, and it was one of the reasons why he was not sent home in 8th place. Ian was an outsider during the first few weeks of the season, since he was not Boogie's closest player, and he was not a part of the Quack Pack yet, or in that grouping. But he did have a relationship with Brittany that brought him into that alliance, and Mike gave him enough information where he was able to get Boogie and Frank targeted, which I don't think was the best move for him, especially at that time. From the final 8 and 7 onwards, he had to win himself into safety, and he didn't even realize that he was being targeted, where he also made it through the final 4 and was shocked where he stayed over Shane, which was the only time in the Dre phase where he wasn't immune. While Ian is good at competitions, and he did improve exponentially socially in the season, he was out of his depth strategically and was not aware of the house dynamics as much as he thought. So here he is, since he does have some good qualities to him.
Like Kevin, people were excited to see how Ian would do, since it had been almost a decade since he last played and needed a lot of growing up to do, as he lived throughout most of his 20s and between seasons. A lot of people mistrusted/distrusted Ian from the very beginning, and the only people he really was aligned to was Nicole, while there was a fake Final Four made with the two of them, Danielle and Cody. Ian did not know what was going on in the house, and even when he was given information from the wall yellers, nothing really came together for him. Ian thought that he was better than the other people who were not in the main alliance in the house, where he absolutely needed them, especially since he didn't have many relationships with people in the committee alliance as a backup. He wanted to do the same thing he did in BB14 with laying low in the first half and beasting in the second half, but the entire cast knew that was his strategy and gameplay, and the dynamics in the season were much tighter, so there was no wiggle room for Ian to sneak in there. To me, it shows that he's not adaptable, still struggles socially, is worse off strategy-wise or strategically, and isn't as strong in competitions, but it's probably still his strongest suit, leading him to be a mediocre player when you look at all of the data. At 32nd is Becky from BB17. There were a lot of people in BB17 who were kind of just there, and while Becky kind of fit into that, she didn't really belong on either alliance or side of the house. This not only made her easy to nominate whenever a pawn was needed, but it also means that they both wanted her as numbers. I will say that Becky was aware of this and was somewhat trying to play both sides and to lay low during the first half of the season, as she just observed everyone. At the same time, this flip-floppiness just made her come off as shady, especially when she tried to help Clay and Shelly during James's second HOH, and Vanessa used this against her when Becky attempted to send Vanessa home during her HOH. By that point in time, Becky did choose a side, but it was a bit too late, and the side she chose was also just a lot weaker, so it is not shocking that Becky went home soon after her HOH failed. Strategically, I do think she is solid, though she struggles with executing it, and she was in the middle socially, and was solid enough competitively, so I can see her doing better in other seasons, or performing very similarly to how she performed here. At 31st is Clay from BB17. What's frustrating about Clay is that he could have very well been a solid player, and he was well on his way to being one as the season was playing out. He was one of the few people in the house who have relationships with people on both sides of the house, and they all thought that he was working with them, even though he caused some drama with Devon, was influential in Jeff being booted, and even getting into it with Audrey later on. So it does show that Clay does have a fuse and is a hothead. He had a decent strategic lens and a decent read on what was happening in the house, though Shelley definitely helped him with that, but he was putting his work and his influence, and that was why the boot order went the way it did. The issue with Clay is that he was not the most self-interested, and he completely gave up when he was nominated. And what makes it even worse is that there was easily room for him to stay, and there was easily a path for him to make sure that happened. Because of his relationship with the goblins, he could have pivoted to them or used them for votes, but he immediately told everyone to vote him out, and his own side realized his relationships with the other side, which is why they wanted him gone. If Clay is focused and self-interested, I think he could have been an upper tier player, but he didn't have that. In another scenario, I could actually see him doing a lot better, but based on what we have in his one season, him being at the top end of mediocre makes sense. At 30th is Liz from BB17. I am kind of shocked that she's in this high end on the mediocre tier, since I don't know if I think highly of her as a player overall. Liz had a chip on her shoulder since she had to contain herself since she wanted Julia to enter as a player. She was on the outs for the first week or two, and her twin secret was exposed, but she was then brought into the Sixth Sense alliance where she and Julia were pretty much used as numbers. Whenever she did have power, she made the obvious move, which is fine, but it isn't super notable. It became clear that she was being led by Austin and Vanessa on a strategic point of view, and while she can be social, she was naturally more reserved than Julia as well, though she was very good competitively, which says a lot since she couldn't even compete in half of the competitions during the first 5 weeks. And while she did make some moves, the fact that she wasn't even really aware of them and couldn't explain herself in the finale shows to me that she lacked self awareness. And I don't know how well she would do without Julia being there or in another season in general. So I'm kind of just all over the place with her. But she has enough decent qualities for her to be where she is. At 29th is Cliff from BB21. Like Liz, I am shocked that he is this high on the list, since I don't think very highly of him as a player. And he also has the element of being evicted more than once in a season. Cliff was on the outs for the first few weeks of the season, and it was why Nick thought it would be so easy to nominate him as a pawn, but Cliff did end up going home in the third week. And while it was partially because they knew he had a chance of coming back, Cliff also ruined his spot by blabbing loudly to the feedsters where he was not going to be targeted earlier on. He pretty much kind of remained the same when he came back and sat on the outlines until like the two-thirds portion of the season, where he was aligned with Jackson and Holly and did everything he could to not only not take a shot against Holly and Jackson, but try taking Jackson to the end, to the point of attempting to turn the showmans against one another, which was just bad. Cliff seems like he knows what to do, but kind of just comes off as a bit too passive. Is better competitively than I thought, but I don't know how well he would do in other seasons, especially on a social standpoint. So I could see him having a similar enough fate that he did during his first round, or he just kind of slides his way to the middle of the season. At 28th is Hayden from BB16. He is someone that shocked me when I rewatched his season, especially since it's not like he got much of an edit on the actual episodes. It seemed like he was not included in the Bach Squad alliance just by happenstance, though he had good relationships with many people in the house. For a lot of the game, he just stuck with Christine and Nicole's strategy or stuck with them strategically, and kind of had a follow the leader mentality for most of his time in the season. It did seem like he was starting to wake up on a strategic lens, where he realized that Frankie and Zach needed to go, and was starting to put the pieces together regarding an alliance. But like Jackie, he was swiftly booted before he could really do anything. But I do have a relatively higher hopes on him as a player due to his relatively solid social skills and potential to grow strategically while being okay in competitions, but I simply put don't have enough information for me to put him in that tier, so here he is in mediocre. At 27th is Brett from BB20. I think he's someone who, yet again, can be a solid player under the right circumstances, but from what I saw on this season, he just did not display that on BB20. Brett was a part of the level 6 alliance, and while he was not at the top of the alliance, he wasn't at the bottom of it either, because he was level headed and not paranoid, like Winston and Rachel were, which is why he was able to stay against them both on the block, and why people saw more worth in him, but it was also why he was seen as a threat as well. The both times that he did stay on the block, it had nothing to do with anything he did, and he did nothing to ease his targets from the other side of the house, which I do fault him for. I didn't notice it initially, but on the rewatch, it was clear that his bro-centric mentality affected his game, where he never seriously aligned with any of the women, and I think Angela and Casey also kind of felt that distance. He pretended to be a rat regarding the other side, but it never really contributed to anything, and he didn't change his position from the bottom of his alliance when the jury portion started, so him getting 6th place isn't shocking. He's middle of the road strategically, competitively, and socially, but isn't as messy as many of the others in this tier that are below him. At 26th is Josh from BB19. Due to the circumstances of Josh's win, I think it's very hard for me and other people in general just to talk about him as a player, and it's why I didn't know where to put him for a while. His game was bad at first, since he was rubbing the house guests the wrong way at first, and he for sure would have been targeted had he not gotten the safety apple in that first week. Luckily for him, he built relationships with Paul and Christmas even before Paul started caring for Josh, and when everyone else was willing to send him home on the fourth week, Paul and Christmas convinced them to keep him. Josh had these moments of thinking individually, like wanting to target Elena instead of Jessica on his HOH, but his execution of it was always poor, and he would always just cater to what Paul and Christmas wanted. He was a decent enough competitor and was pretty sloppy socially as well as strategically, which is why Josh is placed here, especially since he won because Paul lost. I could see him being an early boot on another season, but I could also see him growing as a player due to all of his reality TV experience, though he could just play the same and annoy people socially, or he could really make these strong bonds with a lot of other people. So I think him returning would be very interesting to see where he ends up. At 25th is Danielle from BB8, BB13, and BB22.
I didn't know where Danielle would end up when I started ranking her and how I would feel about her. Danielle was able to get into a majority alliance earlier on in the season, and the house did feel bad for her, but there was a shift in how they viewed her, and I think it was due to her relationship with Nick while having a boyfriend. Right after he was booted, she tried to target someone in her own alliance and did it in the most sloppy way matter, and it failed because she didn't even have the numbers to do so, and some alleged diary room interference to get the others to keep him over Kale. Allegedly. It was good that she made up with Jen, but she threw that away as soon as she could, and she would have been the first juror if her father hadn't saved her with the veto. And she was the one that would have been backdoored if the producers allowed Eric to use the veto in the final seven. I like that Danielle was always willing to make moves, wanted to make moves, and was very self-interested, but she needed to be saved a few times, was heavily reliant on her competition wins, and her social game left a lot to be desired. In a lot of ways, Danielle played the same and differently in her second season, BB13. I do think she improved her social game, as she got close with many of the newbies in the season, and even the vets, especially Rachel and Brendan initially, before she turned on them, and she got closer to Shelley and Porsche as the season went on. Danielle was in a great position within the house, and could have cruised on it, but blew it up by making a move too early regarding turning on the veterans, and needed a comp run of herself and Kalia for the next few HOHs, and as soon as they lost, she went home. She has a lot of the ingredients, good at comps, understands strategy, and can be social, but it's all so messy, and it never comes together very well, hence her being low on this tier.
After 9 years, becoming a wife and mother, there was some curiosity as to how Danielle would play entering her third season, especially since the game and meta has changed since her era. She entered the season being very close to Nicole and was able to bond with Cody, to the point where they are virtually in the same alliances together. Danielle did not want to flip on her alliance too soon, which was the main fault in her last game, but the issue with her game this season is that she was still doing the unnecessarily messy gameplay and planting dry seeds, where people mistrusted her the same as they did in BB13, and also mistrusted her from very early on in the season. And what made it even worse is that she was at the bottom of her alliance and didn't really realize it until it was way too late. So we watched her play for 7th place the entire season. She overestimated her relationship with Cody as well as her entire alliance, while not doing anything with the outsiders until around day 1's boot, but her alliance saw through her gameplay. Danielle lost her competitive ability, her social ability was borderline poor, and her strategic ability was just messy. Danielle always knows what to do, but her pacing is off and she's just too sloppy. So it's just another example of her always being close to being an upper tier player, but never really grasping onto it in the way that she needs to in order to thrive. And the final person in this tier at 24th is Christmas from BB19 and BB22. Despite her playing in 2 seasons and making it to the end game in both of them, I don't know how much I'm actually going to say about her. Someone with her stats should be in one of the 3 upper tier spots, but there are some huge holes in Christmas's gameplay that prevent it. On both seasons, she was way too much of a team player, not really recognizing that you can be in an alliance and also play your own game, but she put everything in the team, which causes for her to lack her own path or agency in the game. I do think her breaking her foot derailed her gameplay in her first season, and she really had no choice but to rely on Paul, especially since he was the main one campaigning for her to stay, but she was just lucky that she was one of the few who were allowed to make it to the end game on the season. She repeated the strategy on her second season, but Tyler was her Paul, though their relationship was a bit more on equal footing, and she did have her own relationships with people like her future husband Memphis and Enzo. The issue with Christmas is that she didn't build much of a relationship with the man in charge of her alliance, i.e., Cody, and she really didn't make much of an effort to improve her position within her own alliance until it was too late. But she didn't do that in BB19, so it was an improvement with her making a move that needed to be made, like evicting Nicole in the triple. Another issue with Christmas is that her personality just rubs people the wrong way after a while, despite her putting a good face socially in the first few weeks, which happened on both seasons, and it's why she almost always ends up struggling to win a jury vote, despite her making it to the endgame on both seasons. If Christmas got over those huge flaws, she could be one of the better players and make it to those three upper tiers, but outside of that, she is okay competitively, inconsistent socially, and okay strategically. At 23rd is Polly from BB18, who's also the first person in this tier. I remember during the season there was some discussion that was very serious about whether he was a better player than his younger brother. While it seems ridiculous to think about that now, since we do know the answer to it, I do think he is more of a natural leader than Cody is. He was pretty close to going home in the first week, and despite not being a part of the 8th Alliance, Polly found a way to not only integrate into the Alliance, where a lot of people in his position could not do, but he changed the dynamics and became the leader that everyone relied on. He had several relationships and several alliances throughout most of the time in the season, and showed some flexibility with those alliances. What is noticeable is that Polly tends to get very emotional when he sees someone turning on or coming after him or rejecting him. The vengeance he has kind of blinds his game, and he tends to make the wrong moves in conjunction to it, and when everyone compared notes about him and his gameplay, he completely fell apart. Polly was good socially until he wasn't in his final few weeks, he was good with strategy until he let his emotions get in the way, and he's great in competitions. I think from what we saw here, he isn't mediocre, and he's great at the top, but not good at the bottom. So I think him being at the bottom of solid is pretty fitting. At 22nd is Shelly from BB17. She's another person that showed that while in the top position of power, Shelly thrives really well as a player in that position, but is also another person that completely crumbles when she is at the bottom or no longer has power. We saw her immediately align with the likes of Devon and Audrey, which immediately fell apart, and she was a part of the reason why that happened. Despite that, she was pretty much offered a spot in the Goblin Alliance and got closer to what would eventually become the Sixth Sense Alliance, and she won power a few times during the pre-jury to take out Devon and Audrey. And the fact that she kept on winning HOHs or close to winning HOHs was a strike against her, really, since it was kind of unnecessary and bringing a lot of attention to her. And what was interesting is that despite her making these cold moves and being a part of the boot structure, the Goblin Alliance still trusted her, and her social game remained very good. But when she sided with the Jason boot, because she was paranoid about people voting out Clay had he stayed on the block, things turned for her since she wanted to hide her hands, and people weren't going to let her do that. When she lost power, Shelley completely crumbled, as she just whined, cried, and was very emotional during her final 2 weeks in the house. She stayed the first time partially because Clay kinda quit, and then she would have stayed during her final week had she not made a big deal about James having Clay's sweater. Shelley is good enough in competition strategy and social skills, but isn't flexible and is too emotional. At 21st is Keisha from Big Brother 10 and Big Brother 22.
I was not expecting her to be this high when I made the list, and I honestly didn't even know if she would get into the solid tier, much less the good tier. She was able to align herself with April and Libra in the beginning and was a part of the 8 Alliance, which lasted about 2 weeks. It did seem like she had better relationships with people who were not in the majority alliance, like Steve, and even someone like Angie approached her to work with the other side, so I think she was doing fine socially, which is something that April nor Libra had. Keisha won HOH and decided to flip the house by ending the 8 and getting Jerry and Rennie on her side, but I don't know how strategic and intentional the choice was. We saw her flip the house once again with keeping Memphis over Jesse, and Libra ended up getting all the blame. I do think she starts faltering off in the second half of the season as she became more passive and complacent, and while she had good read and instinct, like her knowing that she was going home without anyone saying anything, She cannot overcome the duo of Dan and Memphis, even ignoring Rennie's warnings. She is good at competitions. Her instincts are sharp and helps with strategy, and she has a pretty good social game while learning the game as she went on. At the same time, I do think she is way too emotional at times and confrontational. Based on this season, I think she would be a sharp player who can do damage, know when to make the right moves, and really become better.
What is there to really say about her second season? She was an alternate who managed to make it on last minute and really just sat there during the week that she was there. I doubted her campaigning skills in BB10 just based on the fact that the people she was nominated against were such easy targets, and it was solidified here, where she really did nothing of note in that regard when she was against Kevin. It also didn't help that she was close to outsiders in Kaysar and Janelle, but people not knowing her also played a part in her early boot. I think she still has some of the strengths from BB10, but being so distant from Big Brother and the alumni did not help her, and a poor performance here had me ducking her for sure. At 20th is Natalie from BB18. Entering the season, no one really thought much of Natalie and what she could do as a player. She was definitely not in the majority alliance, as she was with the anti-veteran newbies for the first few weeks, but she did have a better social game and was getting closer to people who were not in her alliance, which is why she was spared from being targeted earlier on in the season. There was the Spy Girl alliance, which went to crap once Bridget accidentally sent Bronte home on her HOH, but she mainly focused on getting closer to James and staying under the radar, where that carried her throughout the first half of the season. Of course, she is most noted for making the Zakia flip happen to stop Polly in his tracks, as she was the main person who connected for a while that he was running the season. She got closer to Michelle, which was definitely a good move, and it seemed like she would really take the rest of the season by the horns. The issue started happening with her HOH, where she made the move that she thought America would like with protecting Nicole and Corey, whom she never really had much of a relationship with throughout the season, and turning on Paul and Victor. Not only did a second battle back happen, but the two pairs got together to get rid of herself, Michelle, and to a lesser extent, James, especially as she revealed right at the end of her HOH reign that she wanted Victor to stay, despite her being in an alliance with Corey. She was too passive during the Michelle week, and then when she did campaign for herself in her final week, it just sunk her even more. I think she's good enough strategically when she isn't placating to America, solid enough socially, though a lot of people thought she was fake, and is competent enough competitively, so I could see her repeating or improving on another season. At 19th is Holly from Big Brother 21. It's weird since I don't really know how I feel about her as a player fully, though her edit on the season really doesn't help her in this regard. She was immediately included in the Grateful Alliance since she was seen as a strong woman and really managed her relationships with everyone in that alliance well, while she was not antagonistic to people not in her alliance, so they liked her well enough too. She really was doing well socially for the first half of the season, and even when things were about to go out of control on her HOH, with people wanting to boot Catherine due to their connection, she worked really hard to make sure nothing changed with her HOH, though nominating Catherine so the latter can get more TV time was very dumb to begin with. Even after this, Holly still had good relationships with her former allies and wanted them to get back together, but Jackson ruined it. She was put into the final four alliance with Jackson, Nicole, and Cliff, which she really had nothing to do with, and her relationships with them were a lot weaker than Jackson's in comparison. Holly kind of just let him take the reins for the rest of the season, and was very notable to the other house guests. She threw the final four HOH because her allies wanted her to be vulnerable for eviction, and she had nothing to do with why she stayed in the final five, where she was very close to going home. I do think Holly was intentional with playing under the radar and letting her social game play for itself, but things got out of her grasp. I don't see her being an early boot on most seasons, and I do think she has many positive skills to thrive as a BB player. At 18th is Casey from Big Brother 20. I never thought the most of Casey as a player, and despite her placement on this ranking, I think my opinion of her as a player got worse after the rewatch. She was a part of the Level 6 Alliance and just relied on it throughout the season, and in the first half of the season, she did a good job of not making herself a target, but she really had little influence in the moves that were made. 1. Tyler was doing all the legwork in the first half, and 2. Casey was not the most strong strategically and didn't know a whole lot about what was actually happening. She was just laying back for about the first 6 or so weeks, but was nominated in the 7th week twice and was able to win the power that week, which was able to cause someone from Haley's own alliance to go home, and she nominated Rockstar. Without this, there is a decent chance that Casey is gone as the second juror. or it would have been Angela, which would have affected her game either way. From this point onwards, I believe Casey won at least one competition a week for the rest of the season, though she never used any of the vetoes she won, and her HOHs were always very simplistic moves. Something tells me that Casey was not the most aware of what was actually happening based on her jury answers, and she played a very simplistic game, but she never needed to not play simplistically. Her social game was kind of whole E, as she didn't have much relationships with the other side of the house, and her strategic skills are mid at best, but I think her non-threatening nature overcompensates both of those skills, and that's why I don't ever really see her being an early boot on most seasons, as well as her being good competitively. She's the type of person who does well on most seasons. At 17th is Angela from BB20. Unlike Casey, who I went down on after the rewatch, I went up on Angela as a player. Right from the beginning of the season, she was aligned with level 6 and really just laid back for the first half of the season, as Tyler did the legwork for the alliance, so there's really no need for her to do much of anything. I have to address that she was one of the main targets for the other side during the pre-jury portion of the season, so that was pretty concerning, and she did nothing to build relationships with them throughout that portion of the season. Things turned around for her when she won HOH in the jury portion, where she was convinced by Tyler to target Bailey, the only person who she had somewhat of a relationship with from that side, as she initially wanted Scotty out, and how she handled this HOH, as well as the following one with booting Faisal, just had the others dislike her even more for how she handled it, as she wanted to be very cold and badass in her moves, but would hide in her HOH room for days after the move was done. Angela did start winning a lot of competitions after this and became a tight trio with Casey and Tyler, where they steamrolled everyone. She had more strategic input compared to Casey, so she helped Tyler with this throughout the last part of the season, especially as he started to let go and took his foot off the gas. The issue with Angela is she most likely doesn't win against anyone she wanted to take to the end, and it was known to people, and despite that, Tyler didn't want to go to the end with her. I think she could grow strategically and is good at competitions, but the social is where she really struggles, and she is aware of it, so that's a plus. At 16th is Jackson from BB21. In some ways, Jackson did surprise me after rewatching the season. He seemed more level-headed and more strategically aware, especially compared to Jack, which I never really noticed while watching the season live. He was putting in more work with the outsiders throughout those early weeks, especially Nicole, which is also something that I didn't notice initially, and didn't seem to see things in one way. And I think all that played a part as to why he ended up staying over Jack. Despite that, Jackson still used a lot of aggression and intimidation with his gameplay, was not the best at speaking to people, and was not the best at compromising. His conflict with Christy is really something that could have been settled, but he really let it fester to the point where it blew up the six, and him telling Jack about Catherine and Holly almost caused their games to be completely fucked over. With Catherine going home and Holly having a failed HOH, and he did nothing to rectify that situation. There is a point of time where it seemed like he and Holly could get back in with their old alliance again, but he cannot fake it long enough, and he was just as well as Holly started winning a bunch of competitions. So, he decided to align with Nicole and Cliff, where they all took it to the endgame. He single-handedly gaslit Nicole and Cliff to boot Tommy over Holly during his HOH, and was able to convince Holly to throw the final for HOH, so he could win it to not be vulnerable, and he was always thinking with self-interest, which is a good thing. Jackson is great in competitions, though he had to rely on them too much, is a mixed bag socially, and is pretty competent strategically, but I don't know if he can really rise to be a better player, since his self-awareness isn't there, and his personality is also just his biggest flaw. The final person in this tier at 15th is Steve from Big Brother 17. There are obviously going to be a lot of comparisons to Ian, and I think some of them are somewhat accurate. Steve also had a lot of social awkwardness that did affect his ability to socialize throughout the season, though I don't think he came off weird to the house guests, which wasn't really the case with Ian. He was a pawn during the first part of the season, and while he was closer to the Sixth Sense side of the house, but wasn't really in their core, he became more a part of the alliance with the Scamper Squad, which really took off around the time where clearly we're getting booted. Steve was obsessed with getting out Becky for a while, who didn't even have him on her radar, so that wasn't the best thing in the world. Steve also threw some competitions from what I remember, which caused him to create the path he needed in order to win the season, as he was the one who cut Vanessa. I will say that Steve is very self-aware, which is a really good trait in Big Brother, and he was aware of his strengths and weaknesses. He is pretty good in competitions, though he doesn't need to rely on them. He's pretty solid strategically, and is pretty mixed as a social player. Well, there is definitely a chance he could be in Ian 2.0, meaning how Ian performed in All Stars 2, or some of the other early boots in his archetype. I think he has what it takes to avoid that path. At 14th is Enzo from Big Brother 12 and Big Brother 22.
From what we saw in the season, Enzo is definitely a good player who is aware of his strengths and weaknesses, though coming to the realization of the latter was somewhat humiliating for the most part. Enzo knew that he needed to get into an alliance and was the main person who helped form the brigade, but he was the only person that didn't really contribute to the parachute atmosphere of the alliance, as he didn't have a side piece, quote unquote. I think this was one of the reasons why he was so focused on the alliance, since while he had good social relationships with everyone in the house and they weren't targeting him, you can tell that he got jealous of his allies at times because he didn't have those game relationships with people not in the alliance. At around the midpoint of the season, he and Hayden kind of became partners as they recruited Brendan on their side after Rachel left, and the two decided to turn on Matt, which benefited the both of them. While he made all the moves to get to the end, he did not end up setting himself up to be in the best position to win, and also was not a good competitor. I don't ever see him going early on a season, but I don't know if he has the instincts that would cause him to pull a win, as he overestimated his control and ability in this season.
Entering his second season, while I thought he would play pretty similarly, I thought that a lot of people who had a gap between seasons, and I ended up being proven the exact opposite. I wanted to see how he would improve his gameplay, and I think he did that based on the competitions where he performed much better here than he did on his first season. At the same time, he pretty much did the same gameplay this season, where he mainly stuck with his bromances, especially with Cody. Enzo got himself into a big alliance, is able to woo people socially, but doesn't use those social relationships to influence the actual game, and was essentially playing for second place the entire time. Enzo is decent in competitions, is competent enough strategically, and is good socially, but I just don't think he has the self-interest to be a better player or to even want to improve. So here he is, and he's probably lower than a lot of people have him on their list, but it's my list, so here he is. At 13th is JC from Big Brother 20. He is a person that I, in general, just doesn't like to talk about in general, but as a player, I do find him to be relatively interesting. JC, like Enzo and a few others in the seasons in his era, were attached to an alliance without actually being in the alliance, but he is able to infiltrate into it very well. Outside of Tyler, JC really put in most of the work to trick the other alliance and to carry the level 6 alliance, where most of the actual members of the people who were in the alliance weren't putting in most or much work at all. JC kept on giving information to level 6 from the other side and kept on tricking the Hive Alliance about the votes for the first half of the season, since they thought he voted with him, though he didn't week after week. JC was also the main person who convinced Faisal to completely destroy his alliance by targeting Scotty. All this would have been good had JC actually been a floater and used the other side to take out some of the level 6 members that he wasn't close with, and created a path where he would have the most agency. He was kind of playing for Tyler to win, and ironically, he would have beaten Tyler. And by the time he wanted to target the likes of Angela and Casey, he didn't have the numbers to do so. But if he handled things properly, he would have had the numbers to take them out and be better positioned. Strategically, I think he's impressive, and the same socially, but I also think it's very cast specific, which is why he's on the lower end of this tier, but he is weak in competitions. At 12th is Memphis from Big Brother 10 and Big Brother 22.
He is a very interesting one, since I think he has a lot of the skills to do well in Big Brother in general. He is strategic and approaches the game like a business trip / business opportunity, and he made it known to people, which also put a target on his back at first. He was always looking out for himself and making the optimal moves that he needed to make, which is a good thing. Memphis was close to Jesse in the beginning, or from the beginning, and the Brian move saved him from potentially going first, but he managed to get himself in the 8th alliance. He, Jesse, Michelle, and Angie found themselves at the bottom quickly, but he actually built some relationships with people like Dan, Keisha, which is why he was able to stay over Jesse, as Dan would have saved him even without America's player. After this, Memphis started winning competitions, making deals with people like Jerry so he can take himself and Dan to the end, and the Renegades dominated the second half of the season. The main issue with Memphis is that he came off as too impersonal to the other house guests, and he took Dan to the end, where he came off like Dan's sidekick, so he was the first person to lose a jury vote unanimously. He can make bonds with people, though he's just very selective about it, and we know that he can strategize and compete, but he just doesn't have what it takes to be in the upper tier.
I have mentioned this with a few of the other returnees from Big Brother 22, but I was somewhat interested in seeing how he would handle the game, since things changed so much since he last played. Now that I'm actually thinking about it, not a whole lot's really changed with Memphis, as he formed an uber-tight alliance from the beginning that he wanted to stick with, was procentric as well, which is overlooked by many people, and came off like a smarmy business salesman the entire season. That just ended up kind of working in his advantage during the season, since the game became more meta. Memphis did try to build more relationships, which is an improvement compared to Big Brother 10, but he still had an odd way of dealing with people, so his social game was still inconsistent. Memphis was a bit better in competitions than in his first season, which says a lot since he wasn't bad in that there. He actually did have a chance at winning in the end, so his jury chances went up. Memphis is pretty strategic, though he got way too obsessed with targeting David, is always playing in his self-interest, which is something that was kind of lacking this season, though his social game is still spotty, but he has shown consistency in his skills and placement, so here he is. At 11th is Austin from Big Brother 17. He is someone that somewhat surprised and somewhat didn't surprise me when I rewatched the season. I remember Jace being targeted early on due to his obnoxious personality, but people never really associated that with Austin, to the point that he was able to move on relatively quickly. Of course, the Sixth Sense Alliance was created, and he was one of the main people that pushed for Jeff to go, which benefited him more than anyone else. Austin did get sloppy during the late pre-jury portion of the season by telling Jason about the twin twist to build trust with him, and it just turned into a mess where he was almost backdoored by Vanessa. After that mess happened, he did adjust better as the season went on, as he started building relations with James, Meg, and all of them, so he and his trio would not be targeted, and was really leading things for Liz and Julia, while helping Vanessa. I think the issue with Austin is that he was very obviously a threat, and while he knew Vanessa was an issue, he never took the move to get rid of her, even when he had the opportunity to do so, where she eventually took him out. I think he has the social skills, strategic skills, and is kind of mediocre in competitions, and while I think he is the full package, he's just not as impressive as the others above him, but I can see him making it far on most seasons, so here he is. At 10th is Corey from Big Brother 18. I'm honestly really annoyed that he's in this tier, especially since he's one of the most boring people that I have ever watched on Big Brother. Corey reminds me a lot of Shane, but he at least has some agency and strategic inkling, so it's why they are in different tiers. He almost went home due to the Day 1 to 2 twist, but he was one of the few newbies who immediately knew that kissing up to the veterans was a smart move, which definitely worked out for him, as he was a part of the major alliances happening at the time. He did nothing to convince Bridget to not target him on her HOH, and there was some talk of him potentially getting booted the following week, where he was nominated, before he won that veto. From what I remembered, he just kind of aided Polly without getting most of the smoke, but I do think things improved for him when Polly left. He and Nicole really worked well to weave between everyone else in the house, and he was the one who had to encourage her to make some tough moves, like cutting Victor and attempting to cut Paul. He is competent enough socially, solid strategically, and solid enough in competitions, where I see him doing well on most seasons, and he was close to winning this season. At ninth, I have Tyler from Big Brother 20 and Big Brother 22. Something tells me I have him a bit lower than a lot of other people. Oh my goodness, where do I even start with Tyler? His journey really is all over the place, but when he did start his journey, people thought that he would be arguably the best BB player, and if I was just going off his BB20 performance, he would be a lot higher. He showed so many skills in the first few weeks, the ability to balance both sides, even though he was never really aligned with the other side, masterful manipulation and social skills, the strategic ability to think 10 steps ahead, and was great in competitions. The way he weaved so many webs and dodged so many bullets for so many weeks in a row was something not even Dan and Will did in the earlier weeks in their seasons. Despite all this greatness that he showed, something changed with him during the jury portion of BB20. Once he got into that fight with Bailey, which was the first time he really got any backlash over some of his moves in the game, a part of her just started shutting down and never really recovered, even on his following season. While he was still well positioned within the Alliance, and especially being the center of his Alliance, his social game started declining as he spent more time with Casey and Angela and took his foot off the gas to the point where he let the person that he could easily beat in Angela go out without much of a fight when he should have been fighting to keep her. Of course, he loses that season, but he returns on a second season where we do see a lot of similarities in how he played the game, especially at the start of both seasons. Most of the house really liked him, and he was able to get into the majority alliance, and he made several deals with people throughout this period. But just like his first season, he burnt out here, but he did a lot earlier, all because he missed Angela and had a really codependent relationship with her, where he wanted to quit before sequestered. He then decided to weaponize BLM so he could quit before sequester, and while he did somewhat recover, his relationships really floundered, and he was stuck in the bottom of his alliance, and he could never really catch up to the game, despite trying to with booting Nicole over David. I just think that despite having some great skill sets to really be one of the best, he suffers from severe burnout, and it's a repeated pattern at this point, so we can't just ignore it and act like it's a one-time thing, instead of it just being a consistent thing with how he plays the game. At 8 is Christy from Big Brother 21. It's really crazy that I have her so high on this list, since I do think Christy is flawed as well, but I think she mainly got higher because of the others' flaws grew more and more as I was rearranging the list. Christy did win the first HOH and was able to build a structure around her, and also had solid relationships with people from the other side. I didn't like how she randomly nominated Ovi without telling her allies, and getting paranoid over Nick backdooring her when that was never even a consideration in his mind. I will say that she did play a part in the disintegration of the Six, though I do blame Jackson a lot more for that. What really bolted her up on the list is how she played from the bottom, where she was dead in her rights to get evicted during Jackson's HOH, but she was able to turn it around and convince the house to boot Annalise over her, and the way she did was just so intricate and impressive. She was able to be scrappy from the bottom and play well from the top, though she definitely had a huge hole with her paranoia, and her social game became inconsistent after a while and just not being good at competitions. I give credit to people who can play from the top and the bottom, which is why she is here, and she still had that respect where she could easily win a jury vote. And I do think she could repeat this performance in another season or a situation, which is very important. At 7th is Tommy from Big Brother 21. He is another one that I feel very weirdly about having this high on the list, but like Christy, he benefited from the others having more blatant flaws. When it comes to the social game, Tommy has one of the best I have ever seen in Big Brother, where he of course got along very well with everyone in his alliance, but he got along well with everyone who was not in his alliance either, and no one was targeting him for most of the season. Due to this, he was one of the safest people for a very long time. I think he is pretty sound strategically, where it is in his best interest for his alliance to stay together and not to be the outright leader of it, while maintaining relationships with everyone in the group as well as the outsiders. The issue with Tommy is that he's not really adaptable, since even when it was clear that the Six was over, he tried keeping them together, even when he won HOH a few weeks later, but it was pointless. When he was officially on the outs, Tommy did work on his relationships and used those to his advantage, which was good, and he did fight really hard on his final week, where he did convince them to keep him at some point before the whole Jackson miss. Tommy was better in competitions than I remembered, and what has him higher on the list is that he's someone that I see making it to the end game as a threat almost every single time, and he's someone who would avoid being targeted on most seasons that he's on, so that's a really impressive trait. At 6th is Frankie from Big Brother 16. It's interesting to have him and Tommy pretty much right by one another, though now that I'm thinking about it, Frankie is kind of the more cutthroat and adaptable version of a Tommy, so I guess it makes sense. I was surprised and not surprised at how I felt about him as a player after rewatching his season. I was surprised by him because there are moments where I felt like he was too naive, like him underestimating how much danger he was at certain points in the season, and mainly overestimating his relationship with Derek. I was not shocked with seeing how self-interested he was, and he was always considering what was the best move for him. He was ready to sell anyone out when he realized that he was in danger or when he can take advantage of something or a situation. Frankie was able to get into the big alliance immediately and was one of the more strategic people in the alliance, as he was always thinking about what move they needed to make, and he was very open with making the moves that he needed to make, which kind of built a target on him eventually. Frankie was great in competitions, to the point where it became noticeable to people. He had a good social game, though it wore off a bit because how overtly threatening he is, and he can keep up with the strategy. Frankie had a good chance of winning had the Wee twins not screwed him over, and the thing with Frankie is that I think he could repeat this performance on many other seasons, and I don't think he would be seen as an immediate threat on future seasons. And the final person in this tier is Nicole from Big Brother 16, Big Brother 18, and Big Brother 22. It really is not fun to talk about someone who has been on 3 seasons in a single era. Nicole, in her first season, played a mediocre at best game, since while she did make some strong social connections in her season, and was pretty good in competitions, she was just way too passive and was not aware of the dynamics happening in the house. It was clear to me that she wanted to lay back for the first half of the season and then build her alliances and moves from there afterwards, but it caused her to be on the outs of the dynamics in this season since things were so rigid and tight regarding the dynamics, and she ended up booting people that she needed in the house. But once she started to make her alliances and moves, like the alliance with Hayden, Derek, and Cody, it was just too late. And while she did have good reads on Derek when she returned, and I am docking her for returning, it sealed her fate once again. It did seem like Nicole learned from her mistakes from her first season pertaining gameplay and how she came back in her second season in BB18. Nicole made sure that she was involved in the dynamics of the house on the strategic point of view, or a strategic point of view, though I am sure her being a returnee definitely had a lot to do with it in a mixed season. But she had the 8 alliance as well as the Fatal 5 alliance, while also being close to the guys in her alliance as well. The thing with Nicole is that she did not have good relationships with people not in her alliance, and she came off as more male identified, so she ended up isolating a lot of the women throughout the season. Things did improve for her around 2/3 through the season, where she and Corey were able to weave and plot between the other duos in the house and helped turn the other groups against one another while taking out her personal threats in people like Michelle. Her strategic game improved in the season, and she was okay in competitions, and while she was not the best socially, she made sure that she's respected, which is important in a jury vote. And then there's her third season in BB22, where she implemented a lot of the strategies she used in her second season, getting involved in the major alliances of the season, making sure that she is not seen as a threat amongst people in the cast, and always thinking a few moves ahead compared to most people. I think the issue here is that Nicole was insistent on taking Cody to the end, even though she loses to him, and while there were moments of self-interest, like making other side alliances and duos, I can't really say she grew from BB18. But Nicole is in general pretty cold, strategic, and is able to win competitions, though I think that element of hers did decrease over the seasons. She is easily underestimated, but has proven time and time again that she can hold her own. So the first person in this tier at fourth is Paul from Big Brother 18 and Big Brother 19. For someone who never watched the show beforehand, Paul is extremely impressive in his first season. Paul did start out very poorly due to being aligned with the anti-veteran newbies, especially with Victor and Jose being very disliked. But despite that, Paul was able to work his social game and to get in the good graces of people in power, especially Paulie, and really had to use his social game to work from the bottom of the house. Paul was able to reintegrate with the dynamics, and due to that, it caused Victor to be used as his shield, though Paul was more loyal to Paulie at this point. We saw him be a part of the infamous flip during the early jury portion of the season, and then joined the other newbies and James, only for him and Victor to be turned on, and then he had to fight from the bottom again, where Paul did play pretty sloppily at times. After forming a relationship with Nicole and Corey again, they were able to work together, trick Victor into targeting Natalie, and was able to stay over Victor. Paul had to win out over the last few competitions of the season, though taking James and not owning the gameplay to people like Natalie and Devon was fatal. There's definitely some sloppiness in the way Paul handled things during BB18, but came in a very tight grip, or he had a very tight grip on the house from jump in BB19, though it was partially due to being the sole veteran. Paul was able to create a cult structure from very early on in the season, was given 3 weeks of immunity due to being a veteran, and was able to easily get into the entire house's head and to get them to turn on Cody and Jessica. Paul pretty much controlled every move from start to finish and single-handedly decided who made it far and who didn't in the season. Paul was still great competitively this season, just like last season, was still strategically sound, even better here, and people in the house loved him. But things started turning around in the jury, like picking a fight with Mark during the latter's last night in the house, and not owning the gameplay to Jason and Alex while slitting their throats, and Paul lost again. Paul is one of the most skilled BB players ever, and is very multifaceted, but the inability to own things and still not really studying or watching the show bites him in the butt, where I don't know if Paul can actually learn from prior mistakes. At third is Vanessa from Big Brother 17. A lot of people predicted that she would do well in the preseason, but when the feeds turned on, she was a complete mess, and it caused people to doubt their initial judgment or viewpoint of her. Vanessa pretty much stayed out of things for the first 2 weeks of the season, though she did solidify the Sixth Sense alliance and was the main one who used the twin twist to pull Julia into their alliance. Once she won power, Vanessa really controlled the season and never really let go of the grip she and her alliance had of it. Vanessa always thought a bunch of steps ahead and would always use that to make her arguments for people, which made them feel more secure with her, since her arguments and strategic insight overrode her weaker social game in comparison. After running the game for a month and kind of hiding her deviousness behind her emotions and meltdowns, Vanessa got targeted in the mid game, but a few people survived not only a backdoor but being the main target as a replacement nominee, where she used the other side's emotions and Becky's flakiness against her. Vanessa soon regained power by getting John on her side, and Steve worked closer to her to target the Oz twins, and she was one final HOH competition away from winning. Vanessa is great strategically and competitively, to the point where she relied a bit too much on it at times, but her social game needs a lot of work, though it isn't bad. The thing I have with Vanessa is that I don't know if she can really repeat this performance on another season or situation. The silver prize of second goes to Cody from Big Brother 16 and Big Brother 22. I'm sure many are not surprised with how high he is, and I kind of had no choice. Cody immediately came into BB16 and was one of the most liked people on the season. The guys wanted to be friends with him, and the girls wanted to hook up with him, and that's always something that's going to work in Cody's favor, no matter what season he's on. He was brought into the Bomb Squad and later the Detonators Alliance and used flirting as a strategy, though I think he booted some of the women a bit too early. He had one of the best social games in the season, was more competent strategically than most of his allies, though he still needed a lot of guidance from Derek, and was a strong competitor throughout the season. My thing with Cody is that he would always want to make a certain move or to have his own agency, but was always talked into doing something else, so it had me a lot lower on him as a player in that season. And then there is, of course, the infamous move where he single handedly gave Derek the game by booting Victoria, where he would have won against her. To most people, it was clear that Cody was going to thrive in BB22. Since his season was a recent one, he had the skills to do well on near any and every season. He had some pre-game connections and has pretty privilege, let's be real. When Cody won the first HOH, he was able to set up the structure and hierarchy, which remained throughout the entire season. I will say that Cody benefited from his side winning every single HOH, since if someone else from the other side won one of those early ones, he would have been nominated for sure. But he went through the season without ever being nominated, outplayed everyone strategically, and was easily able to make it to the end. He is great competitively, good socially, and is good strategically, at least in this season. I really don't see a scenario where he ever goes early, and I do have doubts about him potentially turning in his or becoming like his brother once things don't go his way, but Cody was never really in those positions throughout his BB journey, and if he is on another season, I could really see him avoiding being in that position in general, so that's why I'm kind of where I am with him. But Cody's clearly one of the best players of not only this era, but of all time, and to see where he would line up is going to be interesting. And of course, the number one spot goes to Derek from Big Brother 16. To no one's surprise, Derek is at the top of this list. Derek came in with a plan where he was going to act, appear, and look younger to fit in with the younger house guests and to blend in, which works out pretty well. He lay low for the first few weeks, though he was brought into the Bomb Squad alliance, but came off like the savior to the house, even the outsiders, when he sent home Devon, and whatever suspicions they had about the alliance went out with Devon. Derek worked on his relationships with everyone in the house, continued calling the shots throughout the season, but appealed to his allies' egos and made them feel like they are calling the shots, so they would never really suspect Derek. He continued running things the entire season, and he didn't fall in the trap of not being seen as too unthreatening to the point where he couldn't win a jury vote. Derek was not the best in competitions, as I also think he's used some but he could hold his own in them and was great socially and strategically. There's always the doubt about if he could repeat this performance or perform similarly if he was on another season or situation, since he mainly uses skills as a cop to be unthreatening here, and now everyone knows about it. He knows this, which is why I'm sure he will never return, and the one time where things might not go his way, he did freak out a bit. But he played this game masterfully, which is why he's at the top here, or at least for this era. Alrighty, so that is my ranking of the players who were in the modern era of Big Brother from BB16 to BB22. And I feel like there's definitely an interesting bench here. I see a lot of mediocre players and a lot of bad players, and very few in any of the other categories. It'll be interesting to combine who I have here with the other two eras to combine them into one large list. And then, of course, there's going to be the final era, which is the diversity of the postmodern era of BB23, BB24, and BB25. But I might wait to do that list until BB26 comes out, but I really don't know about that. So as to what I'm planning on doing next, I've been trying to upload some BB20 videos and it's been a pain in the you-know-what, which I predicted was going to be the case beforehand. So expect the BB24 review video to be up within the next 24 hours. Since I'm almost finished watching it, I just have to record it. If not, it should be up by tomorrow or Monday at the very least, and then I'll get to BB25, which shall be an interesting journey. And I'm thinking about making my BB Can players tier ranking overall list to put that out since BB Can 12 will be out very soon. So you can follow me on Twitter at lala_Annie. Subscribe here, click the like buttons, and I'll be back with other content soon. Thank you all for supporting me on this very long but very rewarding journey, and I'll be back with other stuff soon. Bye!